A few months ago, I still thought the worst thing my father could take from me was credit. I was wrong. On Christmas Eve, while I was working a double shift in the ER, my parents looked at my 10-year-old daughter and told her, "There's no room for you at our table." My sister drove her 25 minutes back to my empty house, unlocked the door, left her inside alone, and drove away. I didn't scream at my parents. I didn't abandon my patients to go confront them. I made sure my daughter was safe. Then I made one phone call. By sunrise, my father was pounding on my front door, demanding to know what I had done. Before I tell you what happened after that call, I hope you're doing well wherever you're listening from. Stay with me, because that Christmas night uncovered something my family had been hiding for years. And if you enjoy stories like this, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happened next. It was Christmas Eve of 2024, and by 5:30 that evening, I had already been at the hospital long enough to stop noticing the holiday decorations taped crookedly above the nurse's station. Somebody from administration had put a tiny artificial tree beside the staff refrigerator. One of the respiratory therapists had hung a red stocking from the medication room door. There were cookies in the break room that had gone hard around the edges by lunchtime. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and every time the ambulance bay doors opened, a blade of Chicago winter cut straight through the corridor. Inside, nobody cared that it was Christmas Eve. Chest pain did not wait until December 26th. Neither did appendicitis, falls, fevers, car accidents, or panic attacks. I was 39, an ER charge nurse who also handled clinical education, and working a double shift had not been my first choice. 2 nurses had called out. Staffing was thin, and I had agreed to stay because I knew the floor and because Grace was already covered. That mattered. I had not dumped my daughter on my parents at the last minute. Weeks earlier, we had agreed that Grace would spend Christmas Eve afternoon and dinner with my parents while I worked. Christmas Eve was part of my custody time that year, and Grace's father was out of state with his family before his own holiday block began later that week. My mother had acted delighted when I asked. She said Grace could help decorate cookies, watch an old Christmas movie, and open one gift before I picked her up after my shift. Nothing about the plan had felt risky. Around 6, I texted Grace during a quiet stretch and asked whether she had eaten. She sent me a picture of a plate with mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll shaped like a crescent moon. In the corner of the photo, I could see part of my father's dining room and the edge of a dark suit jacket I did not recognize. I assumed it belonged to one of his friends. My parents liked turning holidays into small productions, and my father liked guests who gave him a reason to open better wine. 10 minutes later, my mother texted, "Your father wants to call you. Henry is here." I knew the name immediately. Henry Sloan was my father's boss, the senior executive everyone in Philip Nolan's company treated with the careful respect reserved for people who could change careers with one decision. My father was a senior vice president at a healthcare staffing company, and for the past several years he had become almost inseparable from something everyone called the Nolan Surge Framework. It was a staffing model his company used when hospitals faced sudden demand spikes. My mother had forwarded me brochures about it more than once. Philip had received awards for it. He had given conference presentations about it. I had never paid much attention. My father and I worked in adjacent worlds, but not the same one. I handled actual nurses, actual patients, actual staffing failures at 3 in the morning. He handled contracts, executives, forecasts, and polished presentations. My mother called before I could answer the text. I stepped away from the main desk, told another nurse where I was going, and went into a small staff room where no patient information was visible behind me. When I answered, my father's face filled the screen first. He was dressed in a charcoal jacket and red tie. Behind him, I could see the mantle in the living room and the glass award he usually kept in his office. He had brought it home for the evening and positioned it where anyone at the table could see it. The engraving caught the light every time he shifted his phone. Leadership through family values. Even then, I noticed the irony. I just did not know how much it would matter later. "Look who decided to join us," Dad said. He turned the phone so I could see the table. Mom was beside him. My younger sister, Marissa, was across from Grace. At the far end sat Henry Sloan and his wife. Henry lifted one hand in greeting. "Merry Christmas, Erica," he said. Your father tells me you're holding down an emergency department tonight. Trying to, I said. Merry Christmas. Dad laughed. She can manage a trauma floor. She just can't manage Christmas without outsourcing the kid. There was a pause around the table that lasted maybe 1 second, but I felt it. Marissa looked down at her plate. My mother smiled in that thin way she used when she wanted everyone to pretend a joke had landed better than it had. Henry's wife glanced at Grace. I could have embarrassed my father right back. I knew exactly how. I could have pointed out that the childcare arrangement had been planned for weeks and that Mom had volunteered. I could have reminded him how many times he had bragged to people that his oldest daughter ran an ER floor. But I was standing in a hospital staff room in the middle of a shift, and I had no interest in performing a family argument for a stranger. So Grace has eaten? I asked. Grace leaned toward the phone. I had 2 rolls. That means 1 vegetable minimum, I told her. I ate green beans. Then I'll allow the second roll. She grinned. That was the conversation I cared about. Henry laughed softly and asked me what kind of volume we were seeing that night. I answered in general terms. Nothing patient-specific, just what anyone in emergency medicine might say. Holidays could look calm until they did not, and staffing was more complicated than headcount, because one badly placed shortage could hurt an entire department. Henry nodded. That's actually something I wanted to ask you about. Philip's been walking us through a surge allocation model, and I'm always interested in how these things look from the floor instead of the conference room. Dad cut in before I could respond. Trust me, Henry, you don't want Erica's version. Everything is a crisis when you work in emergency medicine. He laughed again. I looked at his face on the screen. His smile was easy, practiced. If I had not known him my whole life, I might have thought he was simply being proud in a clumsy way. Henry did not laugh this time. I actually do want her version. Dad's smile held, but something in his eyes changed. Henry asked whether I had ever worked with surge mapping or tiered reassignment systems. Before I could answer, someone called my name from the hallway. I held up 1 finger and told them I would be out in a moment. That was when Grace spoke. Mom has one like Grandpa's. Dad turned toward her. What? Henry asked. Grace pointed at a binder lying open beside my father. From where I was looking through the phone, I could only see part of a page. Blocks of red and blue. Arrows. A flow pattern. Grace leaned closer. That chart. Mom has one like that, the red and blue one. My father closed the binder. Not slammed. Not dramatically. He simply placed 1 hand over the page and folded the cover shut. Grace, he said. Adults are talking. She immediately sat back. Henry looked from my father to the binder. What does she mean? Grace glanced at me on the screen as though she needed permission. I said, You can answer him. She shrugged. Mom showed me a picture once because I asked why she had to move nurses around when the emergency room got too busy. Hers had red boxes and blue boxes too. I remembered the chart she meant. Years earlier, when Grace had been younger, and frustrated that I had missed a school event because of a staffing emergency, I had drawn a simplified version of a capacity model to explain why sometimes the number of nurses mattered less than where those nurses were placed. It had been a child-friendly drawing, not confidential information. Red meant pressure. Blue meant available support. Grace remembered colors better than terminology. Dad picked up his wine glass. She's 10. To her, every flowchart probably looks the same. Maybe that was true. At the time, I had no reason to treat a child's visual comparison like evidence. But I noticed something else. My father did not reopen the binder. Henry looked back at me. I'd still like to hear your perspective sometime. Sure. I'll text you my contact information. Your father has my number, obviously, but this way you don't have to go through him. Dad said, Henry, she's working. I know. The exchange was small enough that I nearly forgot it in the moment. My phone buzzed less than a minute later. Henry had sent a brief message with his direct number and a digital contact card. Whenever you're off the clock, no rush. Merry Christmas. I saved it. Then someone opened the staff room door and told me we had an ambulance coming in with a patient who had deteriorated en route. I have to go, I said. Grace waved. Love you, Mom. Love you too. I'll call later. My father lifted his glass toward the camera. Try not to save the entire city before dessert. I disconnected without answering. For the next hour and a half, my world narrowed to the things directly in front of me. Monitor alarms, medication checks, a family trying to understand why they could not go back with their father yet, a resident asking me for a second opinion about whether a patient's condition had changed, 2 nurses trying to take breaks without leaving the department dangerously thin. That was what I meant when I said I could handle things. I was good at separating urgent from merely loud. My family had always known that about me. I just did not understand yet how much they had come to depend on it. Shortly before 8:30, I glanced at my phone and saw 3 missed calls from Grace. That was unusual. Grace knew not to call repeatedly unless she needed me. I stepped into the same staff room and called her back. She answered on the first ring. "Mom?" Her voice was too quiet. "What happened? Are you coming home soon?" I looked at the clock. "Not yet. Why?" There was a small pause. "I'm at home." For a second, I thought she meant my parents' house. Children sometimes used home loosely when they were tired. "At Grandma's?" "No, our house." I stood up straighter. "Who's with you?" Another pause. "Nobody." Every sound around me seemed to disappear. "Grace, I need you to tell me exactly where you are." "In the kitchen." "Our kitchen?" "Yes." "Is Aunt Marissa there?" "She left." My hand tightened around the phone. "What do you mean she left?" "She drove away." I looked through the narrow window in the staff room door at the nurse's station. I could see people moving. I could hear a monitor alarming somewhere beyond the wall. My first instinct was not to call my father. It was not to call Marissa. It was not even to ask why. It was to establish safety. "Okay, lock the front door." "It is locked." "Check it anyway." I heard her walk. "It's locked." "Good. Keep the phone with you. I'm calling Mrs. Palmer." Mrs. Palmer lived 4 houses down from us. She was a retired elementary school secretary, had known Grace since kindergarten, and was one of the few people I trusted enough to have an emergency key code. I called her immediately. She answered, heard the situation, and said she was putting on shoes. "I can be there in 3 minutes. Call me when you have her." Then I called Grace again, and stayed on the phone until Mrs. Palmer knocked. I made Grace check through the front camera before opening the door. When I saw Mrs. Palmer's face appear on Grace's screen, I felt my breathing slow for the first time. "Go with her," I said. "Are you mad?" "At you?" "No. Grandpa was." That stopped me. "Why?" "I don't know." "Tell me what happened." She started from the dinner table. After my video call ended, Henry had stayed. The adults kept talking. Grace said Grandpa told her she had interrupted an important conversation. Mom told her to go watch television for a while. Later, when Grace came back because she was hungry again, Dad told her they were continuing an adult business dinner. Then came the sentence, "There's no room for you at our table." Grace repeated it without drama, which somehow made it worse. She said my mother had told Marissa to take her home. Grace reminded them I was still working. Marissa had said the same thing. According to Grace, Dad answered, "Your mother will figure it out." Marissa drove her back to my house. Grace knew the smart lock code, so she could get inside. Marissa waited until the door opened, then left. I asked, "Did she say she was coming back?" "No." "Did Grandma?" "No." "Did Grandpa?" "No." "Did anyone call me?" "No." I closed my eyes. Mrs. Palmer appeared behind Grace and placed a hand on her shoulder. I told Grace to go with her, eat something, and stay there until I called again. "Mom?" "Yes?" Was I not supposed to say the thing about the chart? The question hit me differently. "What makes you ask that?" "Because Grandpa was normal before that." I did not ask her to interpret his emotions. I knew better than to lead a child toward the answer I was already beginning to suspect. Instead, I said, "You didn't do anything wrong. I need you to remember that." After I hung up, I stared at the dark phone screen. 2 separate things were sitting in my mind. My father humiliating me in front of Henry. Grace mentioning my red and blue chart. My father removing her from the table. At first, they did not fit together. Then I remembered the way Dad had closed the binder. And the way Henry had asked me about surge mapping right before Dad turned the conversation into a joke about my motherhood. I opened Henry's text. For several seconds, I considered calling my father first. That would have been the old version of me. The Erica who wanted to hear his explanation before letting anyone else see the problem. The Erica who believed family deserved one more private chance because public consequences were somehow crueler than private behavior. Then I thought about Grace standing alone in my kitchen. I thought about Dad saying I would figure it out. He was right. I would. Just not in the way he expected. I tapped Henry's number. He answered after several rings. Erika? I'm sorry to call you tonight. Is everything all right? My daughter is safe, that's not why I'm calling. There was silence on his end. I kept my voice level. You asked my father tonight where he developed the surge framework. Yes. Before you rely on his answer, there's something you should know. Another pause. I still have the original files. Henry did not gasp. He did not accuse my father. He did not tell me I had just destroyed a career. He asked the only question that mattered. What year did you create the first version? By the time I got home that Christmas morning, the sky over the suburbs was still black, and the cold had sharpened enough to make every breath hurt. I had been awake for almost 20 hours. My shoulders ached from standing. My feet felt swollen inside my shoes, and I could still smell hospital sanitizer on my hands even after washing them twice before I left. My neighbor had walked Grace back to our house once I texted that I was 10 minutes away. She had stayed until I came through the door, then squeezed my arm and told me not to worry about thanking her. Grace was asleep in my bed instead of her own, curled on my side beneath the comforter with one hand still wrapped around her phone. I stood in the doorway for a long moment and watched her breathe. That was the first time all night I let myself feel how angry I actually was. I did not call my parents. I did not call Marissa. I did not replay the argument I could have had if I had been the kind of person who believed shouting made facts clearer. I changed out of my scrubs, checked that the doors were locked, set my phone on the nightstand, and climbed into bed beside Grace without waking her. I thought I might sleep for 3 hours. Maybe 4, if the world showed mercy. I had barely drifted off when pounding rattled the front door hard enough to make Grace jerk awake beside me. For one disoriented second, I thought I was still in the emergency room and someone was hitting a crash cart drawer. Then the pounding came again, followed by my father's voice from outside. Erica, open this door. Grace sat up fast, her face pale in the blue light leaking through the blinds. I put one hand on her shoulder and told her to stay where she was. My phone said it was just after sunrise. I pulled on sweatpants and a sweatshirt, walked to the front door, and checked the camera before opening it. My father stood on the porch in the same dark slacks he had worn the night before, only now his shirt collar was open and his coat was hanging crooked from one shoulder. My mother stood behind him with her arms folded tightly across her chest. Neither of them looked like people who had come to apologize to a 10-year-old girl. The second I opened the door, my father stepped forward as if he expected me to move aside. I did not. He stopped because my body was still in the doorway, and for a few seconds we simply looked at each other. What did you tell Henry? He demanded. Not how is Grace. Not did she get home safely. Not I'm sorry. His first question was about his boss. That told me more than any confession could have at that point. I crossed my arms and said, "Good morning to you too." His jaw tightened. Behind him, my mother whispered my name in the exhausted tone she had always used when she wanted me to make someone else easier to deal with. My father lowered his voice, but that only made it harder. Henry emailed me at 2:14 this morning. My promotion review is on hold. He told me not to alter, delete, or dispose of anything related to the surge framework until he follows up after the holiday. Do you understand what you've done? I did understand something, but not what he wanted me to understand. Henry had not fired him. He had not accused him publicly. He had not summoned some imaginary compliance army into the office on Christmas morning. He had done exactly what a careful executive should do after hearing there might be a provenance issue involving a major piece of work tied to a promotion. He had stopped the process long enough to preserve the facts. My father was the one standing on my porch, acting as though a pause was a verdict. What did you tell him? He asked again. I said, I told him I have the original files. My mother made a small sound behind him. My father stared at me as though I had just admitted to setting fire to his office. Original files of what? He asked, and that question almost made me laugh. Instead, I held his gaze and said, "If you have to ask me that, then you shouldn't be this upset." His face changed. It was subtle, just a tightening around the eyes. But I had spent half my adult life reading tiny changes in people's faces before they admitted they were in pain. My father was afraid. My mother stepped around him. "Erica, this is ridiculous. Henry was a guest in our home. Your father was trying to have one nice Christmas dinner, and somehow now his career is being dragged into family drama because Grace got upset." I looked at her for a second before answering. "Grace did not get upset. Grace was taken from your house and left alone in mine while I was at work." Carol shook her head immediately. "Marissa thought you were getting off soon," I asked. "Did Marissa know what time my shift ended?" She hesitated. That was enough. "Did you?" I asked. She looked at my father instead of me. Philip cut in. "She had a phone. She was inside her own house. Stop making this sound like she was abandoned on the side of a highway." His wording was so efficient that I almost admired it. He had already moved the goalposts from whether leaving her alone was acceptable to whether the situation could have been worse. I had heard that tactic before, just not usually about my daughter. "You told a 10-year-old there was no room for her at your table," I said. "Then you sent her away because she interrupted a business conversation." He lifted his chin. "That is not what happened," I said. "Then tell me what happened." He did not answer that. Instead, he went back to Henry. He told me I had no idea how complicated corporate promotion reviews were. He told me an allegation like this could stain his reputation even if it turned out to be nothing. He told me he had spent decades building trust with that company. Every sentence was about what could happen to him. My mother kept inserting phrases like misunderstanding, unfortunate timing, and family matter. Neither one of them said Grace's name until I did. That was when I stopped wondering whether I was being unfair. People reveal their priorities most clearly when they are frightened. My father was terrified, and the thing he was trying to protect was not his relationship with his granddaughter. I finally said, "Henry told you not to change anything, so don't." My father stared at me. "That's your answer?" I nodded. "Yes." He stepped closer. "You call him today and tell him this was a misunderstanding." I did not raise my voice. "I'm not telling anyone something I don't know is true." His mouth pulled into a hard line. "You know exactly what's true," I said. "Then you shouldn't be worried about someone checking." That landed harder than shouting would have. My mother closed her eyes briefly, as if I had failed some test of family loyalty she had never actually explained. The sound of bare feet behind me made all three of us turn. Grace stood at the end of the hall in an oversized t-shirt, her hair tangled from sleep. The moment she saw my parents, she stopped. My father's expression shifted into something softer, almost automatically. "Sweetheart," he began. Grace did not move toward him. She looked at me instead. That was enough for me. I stepped back inside and told my parents the conversation was over. My father said my name sharply. I closed the door before he could turn it into another command. Grace did not ask why Grandpa was angry. She asked if she had done something wrong by talking about the chart. That question made something cold settle in my chest. I brought her into the kitchen, heated milk for her, and sat across from her at the table. "No," I told her. "You didn't do anything wrong." She traced one finger around the rim of her mug. Then she said, "He got mad after I said it looked like yours." I did not lead her. I did not ask what I wanted to hear. I had questioned frightened patients for years, and I knew how easily an adult could put a story into a child's mouth without meaning to. So I asked, "Tell me what happened from the beginning." Grace said Henry had been looking through a binder while everyone finished dinner. He had asked Grandpa something about what happened when too many hospitals needed nurses at the same time. Grace had been coloring at the end of the table and glanced over because the chart was bright. Red blocks, blue blocks, arrows between them. She told Henry, "My mom has one like that." Grandpa told her not to interrupt. Henry smiled and asked what she meant. Grace said I had once shown her a simple chart explaining why some nurses got moved when the emergency room became crowded. Then Grandpa closed the binder. According to Grace, nobody yelled. That was what made it stranger. Grandpa simply became very polite. A little while later, Mom told Grace that Henry and his wife were staying longer to discuss business. Dad said the table was crowded and that there was no room for kids during an adult conversation. Marissa was told to take Grace home. Grace had reminded them I was still at work. Dad had said, "Your mother will figure it out." I had heard variations of that sentence my whole life. Erica will figure it out. Erica doesn't need help. Erica can handle it. For years, I had accepted those words as compliments. Hearing them repeated through my daughter's mouth changed their shape. I asked Grace whether anyone had said why the chart mattered. She shook her head. I asked if Henry seemed upset. She said no. I asked if my father did. Grace thought for a second and said, "Not mad. More like when you thought you lost your badge at work." That description was so precise, I almost smiled. Panic hidden under control. I thanked her, told her again that none of this was her fault, and sent her to watch a movie while I made breakfast. I waited until she was settled before opening my laptop. The oldest copy of my Surge model was not hard to find. I had never been sentimental about work, but I was obsessive about versions. Years in emergency medicine had taught me that if something mattered, you documented when it happened and what changed. The file sat inside an old folder from my nursing leadership certification program. I opened it and saw the title page with my name at the top. The document looked almost embarrassingly plain compared with the polished corporate materials I had seen around my father's office over the years. No glossy branding, no executive language. Just the model, the assumptions, the staffing thresholds, and the red and blue flow structure Grace remembered. Seeing it brought back an afternoon I had not thought about in years. I had been sitting at my kitchen counter with a cold cup of coffee and 3 printed drafts spread around me. I had called Dad because I wanted his opinion, not his permission, his opinion. Back then, I respected the way he could take a complicated idea and make people understand why it mattered. I emailed him the draft and asked him to tell me where a non-clinical reader might get lost. He sent it back with comments in the margins. Some of them were good. One of them had changed the way I explained the entire first section. That memory hurt more than if he had always been useless to me. The person I was beginning to suspect of taking my work had also once helped me make it better. I searched my sent mail next. The email was still there. My message to him was ordinary enough that I had probably forgotten it within a week of sending it. I asked him to review the structure and attach the file. The date stopped me. I opened the submission receipt from the leadership program archive. Same period. Same version. Then I pulled up an old company brochure about my father's Surge framework that I had saved years earlier because my mother had proudly emailed it to everyone in the family. It described Philip Nolan as having begun developing his staffing methodology 14 months after the date on my submission receipt. 14 months by itself did not prove theft. I knew that. Similar people can arrive at similar ideas. A father can learn from his daughter without committing some grand fraud. A good investigator does not fall in love with the first explanation that fits the emotion of the moment. So I forced myself to slow down. I opened the corporate brochure and my capstone side by side. I did not look for things that felt similar. I looked for structure, sequence, terminology, the order in which problems were solved. The places where my original model made unusual choices. That was when my exhaustion disappeared. The first section of Dad's framework followed the same decision order as mine. The same unusual division between red and blue staffing pressure. The same phrasing around reassignment thresholds. Even one awkward expression I had always meant to revise was sitting inside his polished version, dressed in a better font. My hands went still over the keyboard. For the first time since Grace called me from the empty house, I felt something colder than anger. I felt the clean, precise certainty that comes when scattered facts stop looking scattered. I went back into my sent folder and searched my father's name again. There were more messages than I expected. Birthday plans, family photos, a recipe my mother had asked me to forward. Then one subject line appeared from years earlier, attached to a file I had not opened since the day I sent it. Dad, final version before submission. I clicked it. The attachment timestamp sat there in black and white, more than a year before the date his company said Philip Nolan began developing the framework that had made his career. And that was the moment I stopped asking whether my father had borrowed from me. I started asking how much he had taken. By the day after Christmas, my father had stopped pounding on my door and started using other people to do the knocking for him. My mother called first. She waited until mid-morning, which was considerate by her standards, and opened with, "I just want to make sure Grace is all right." For a few seconds, I let myself believe that was really why she had called. Then she added, "And I think we need to talk about what happened with your father before this gets any more out of hand." There it was. Grace was the doorway. Philip was still the room she wanted to enter. I was sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open and 3 documents spread beside it. Grace was in the living room building a blanket fort and pretending not to listen. I had slept enough to stop feeling physically sick from exhaustion, but not enough to soften what I had found. My original capstone was open on the screen. Beside it was an old corporate brochure featuring my father under the heading Building Resilient Healthcare Systems Through Adaptive Staffing. The third document was the submission receipt from my leadership program, dated 14 months before the company's own materials said Philip Nolan had begun developing what became the Nolan Surge framework. "I'm listening," I told my mother. Carol exhaled, as though I had already made things difficult. "Your father says Henry misunderstood what you told him." I told Henry I still had the original files. "Exactly. You made it sound like your father stole something from you." I told him I had files. Henry decided what that meant. "You knew what it would sound like." I leaned back in my chair. That was one of my mother's favorite arguments. If someone reacted badly to the truth, responsibility somehow migrated to the person who had spoken it. "Did Dad use my work?" I asked. She went quiet. I could hear the television in the background at my parents' house. Some Christmas movie was playing, the kind with sleigh bells under every conversation. The normalcy of it irritated me more than shouting would have. "Erica," she said finally, "your father has worked in healthcare operations for decades. Of course, things you discussed over the years influenced him." That wasn't my question. Families influence each other. Did he use my work? Carol sighed. "You're making this sound very black and white." That answer was useful. Not because it proved anything corporate, it didn't. But my mother was a terrible liar when she had to deny something directly. She was much better at changing the moral frame until the thing no longer sounded wrong. "I'm not asking whether families help each other," I said. "I'm asking whether Dad took material I created and used it in the framework. He gave you feedback on that material." "I know. So then why are you pretending he had nothing to do with it?" I looked at the printed draft beside me, the one with my father's old comments in the margins. He had written "too technical for executives" beside one paragraph and moved this example earlier beside another. Those notes were real. Some had helped. I had never denied that. What I was beginning to understand was how easily a legitimate contribution could be stretched until it swallowed the person who had created the thing in the first place. If Dad believes helping me rearrange a presentation made the framework his, I said, he can explain that to Henry. That is exactly the kind of thing I mean. My mother's voice sharpened. "You always talk as if family conversations should be handled like depositions. I'm asking a yes or no question, and I'm telling you relationships don't work that way." I glanced toward the living room. Grace had draped a blanket over 2 dining chairs and was crawling underneath it with a flashlight. One of the things I had always prided myself on was giving her clear answers. Not always easy answers, but clear ones. I was starting to understand how much of my childhood had been lived in fog, created by people who benefited from never naming anything precisely. "Then we're done for now," I said. "Erika, I need to go. Your father's promotion is frozen because of this." "Then maybe you should ask him why a few old files scare him that much." I hung up before she could turn that into another discussion about loyalty. Grace poked her head around the doorway. "Grandma?" "Yes." "Is she mad?" "She's worried." "About Grandpa?" "Mostly." Grace absorbed that. Children can hear hierarchy even when adults do their best to wrap it in softer language. She nodded once and disappeared back into the living room. I stared at my mother's name on the screen for another second, then opened the corporate brochure again. I had spent the morning comparing documents the way I compared patient charts when 2 accounts of the same event did not line up, not by looking for what felt suspicious, by looking for sequence. My capstone began with 3 operational questions. How much pressure existed? What kind of support was actually available? and where reassignment would do the least damage. The corporate framework began with the same 3 questions, softened into executive language. My model separated pressure into red and support capacity into blue because those were the colors I had used in the original training diagrams. Dad's version used the same split. Even the order of escalation steps matched. But there was something else. A phrase I had always disliked was still in his material. Capacity can exist and still be unusable if it is placed in the wrong unit at the wrong time. I remembered writing that sentence at 2 a.m. during the certification program, then telling myself I would fix it later because it sounded clumsy. I never did. Dad's corporate deck replaced unusable with operationally inaccessible, but the sentence structure and the sequence around it remained almost identical. That was not proof by itself either. But it was enough to stop me from dismissing Grace's observation as coincidence. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Marissa. "Can we talk?" Mom says, "You're turning this into some kind of investigation." I stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, "You can call." She did immediately. "Are you serious right now?" she asked. No greeting. Apparently Christmas had stripped everyone in my family down to their preferred opening line. About what? Dad's job. "I'm serious about finding out what happened." "You know what happened. He used some ideas you talked about years ago." "That's it. You sound very certain." "Because I've seen the framework." That got my attention. I closed my laptop halfway, not because Grace could hear, but because I wanted to focus on Marissa's exact words. "When?" "What do you mean, when? When did you see it?" She hesitated just long enough to matter. "I've seen his presentations, everybody has." "That isn't what you meant." "Oh my God, Erica. Did you work on it?" Another silence. Then she laughed once, sharp and humorless. "This is exactly why nobody wants to talk to you when you get like this. When I ask a question, when you act like everybody is on trial." I almost smiled. Mom and Marissa had reached the same defense within 24 hours. I did not think they had rehearsed it. Families do not need to rehearse the scripts they have used for years. "Did you work on Dad's framework?" I asked again. I helped him clean up some materials. "What materials?" "Slides, language, presentation stuff." "From what source?" "His notes, old decks, things he sent me." My fingers went still on the table. Marissa had always been better at branding than I was. She could take a page of ugly information and make it look expensive. Years ago, when she started her communications consultancy, I had admired that about her. She did not understand my work at a clinical level, but she understood how people looked at information. Dad respected that skill because it resembled his own. "How much did he pay you?" I asked. "What? You said you helped him clean up materials. Was that through your company?" "That's none of your business." "That means yes." "It means my finances are not yours." "Fair enough. Did he pay you to work on materials that came from me?" "I don't know what came from you." I looked at my old sent mail search still open on the second monitor. Her answer did not sound like a lie exactly. It sounded carefully narrowed. "You told me a minute ago this was just Dad using ideas we talked about," I said. "Now you don't know what came from me, because I don't keep a forensic chain of custody on every PowerPoint I've touched." "That isn't what I asked." "Erica, Dad has been building this for years. You sent him stuff. He gave you feedback. You all talked about staffing at dinner more times than I can count. You cannot decide now that every idea in his head belongs to you." "Did he ever say I created the original model?" Marissa exhaled loudly. "Why does that matter so much to you?" The question surprised me. Not because it was deep, because she seemed genuinely confused. Because if he told a company he created something I created, it matters. "You already have a career." I looked toward the living room again. That sentence was so familiar I could almost hear my mother saying it. "You already have a career." As if ownership existed only for people who needed rescue. As if success canceled the right to be credited for what you did. "What does my having a career have to do with it?" I asked. "You're respected at the hospital. You have your certifications. You have your job." Dad took something technical and made it usable in an entirely different environment. "So that's the family position now?" "What family position?" "That because I'm doing fine, it doesn't matter what he used." "That is not what I said." "It's what you meant." "No." What I mean is, you're turning years of overlap into theft because you're angry about Christmas. There it was. I could have told her exactly why I was angry about Christmas. I could have asked how she managed to drive a 10-year-old to an empty house, watch her go inside and leave. I wanted to, but that argument would still be there later, and I had learned enough in the previous 12 hours to know that people sometimes answered the question you cared about most by refusing to answer a different one. So the timing is the problem? I asked. Yes. Not what Dad actually did? You don't know what Dad actually did. Neither do you, apparently. She made a frustrated sound. Family doesn't keep score like this, Erica. I wrote that sentence down. Literally. There was a legal pad beside my laptop, and I wrote, Family doesn't keep score. Then beneath it, ask what Marissa saw. Is that what you told yourself when you worked on his materials? I asked. The line went quiet. When Marissa spoke again, her voice had changed. I have a client call. Of course. You're impossible. Send me the name of the deck you worked on. No. Then I'll find it another way. She hung up. I did not call back. That afternoon, Henry's office sent me an email through a compliance address, exactly as he had told me it would. The message was short and careful. They were reviewing the provenance and development history of the Surge framework tied to Philip's pending promotion. They were not asking me to accuse anyone. They wanted me to identify which portions, if any, I believed came from work I had created and what supporting records I possessed. I appreciated the wording. It did not say, prove your father stole from you. It did not say, we believe you. It asked for what I could actually support. There was also a limited PDF attachment containing selected portions of the corporate framework for comparison. I made coffee, put my phone on silent, and started reading. The first 30 pages made me feel sick in a way the brochure had not. A brochure could simplify. A marketing document could borrow language without revealing much. This was different. The framework contained the logic beneath the language, the sequence of thresholds, the order of reassignment, the way capacity was separated from availability. The same red and blue visual structure Grace had noticed. I found one mistake I had made in the original capstone and later corrected in my own professional notes. It was still there in Dad's version. Not an obvious mistake. Nothing dramatic. I had grouped one type of float coverage under the wrong operational category because that was how our training program had defined it at the time. A year later, after working with the model more, I had changed it. Dad's version preserved the old classification. I leaned back. That was the first moment I stopped feeling like I might be imagining the pattern. Still, I forced myself to keep going. About halfway through the material, I found something that confused me. A refinement in the escalation map. It was mine. I was sure of that because I remembered exactly why I had changed it. During a later training exercise, I had realized the earlier version treated two kinds of staffing pressure as if they escalated at the same rate. They did not. I had split them into separate branches. That refinement did not exist in the capstone I had sent Dad. I opened my original email to him and checked the attachment. Old version. I checked again. Still the old version. Dad should not have had the refinement. For several minutes, I sat there staring at the corporate chart, trying to remember who else had ever seen it. Then a memory surfaced. Marissa. Years earlier, not long after she started her consultancy, she had called me in a panic because she was helping with a community health presentation and needed something visual to explain surge staffing. She did not need hospital data. She wanted a clean example of how a system redistributed people when demand moved. I had sent her an updated deck. I remembered doing it because she had complained that my first version was ugly. Please tell me nurses don't actually present like this, she had joked. I had told her to make it prettier if she cared that much. I searched my sent folder. There it was. To Marissa Nolan. Subject: Updated surge model, use whichever slide helps. I opened the attachment. The refinement was there. The exact refinement in Dad's corporate framework. I stared at it for a long time before I did anything else. The easy response would have been to call Marissa again and demand an explanation. The emotional response would have been to send her both files and ask what kind of sister takes a document handed to her in trust and feeds it into Dad's career. I did neither. Instead, I opened a blank document. At the top, I typed, source timeline. Then I made 3 columns. What I sent Dad, What I sent Marissa. What appeared in the corporate version. Under Dad, I listed the original capstone and the dates. Under Marissa, I listed the updated deck and the refinement she had received. Under the corporate version, I listed both. By the time I finished, the pattern was no longer emotional. It was chronological. Dad had material I gave him directly. Then he somehow acquired a later refinement I had only given Marissa. I saved the timeline to my encrypted work archive and a personal backup, then printed a copy and put it in a plain folder in my desk. Grace wandered into the kitchen while I was closing the laptop. "Are you working?" "Kind of." "On Grandpa?" I looked at her. Children often say the thing adults spend hours trying not to say. "On something connected to Grandpa." She climbed into the chair across from me. "Is it because I told Mr. Sloan about the chart?" "No. But if I didn't say it, none of this would happen. That doesn't mean you caused it." She frowned. I turned the laptop around, not enough for her to read the files, just enough to show her a blank document with 3 columns. "See this?" I asked. "All I'm doing is figuring out what happened before you ever said anything." She considered that. "So it already happened?" "Yes. Before Christmas?" "Long before Christmas." She seemed relieved. I was too, in a strange way, because saying it out loud clarified something for me. Christmas had not created the problem. Christmas had only exposed the seam. That evening, I received another message from Marissa. "Mom says you're sending documents to Dad's company." I did not answer immediately. A second message came. "You need to think about what you're doing to this family." I read it twice. Then I looked at the timeline on my screen. My original capstone had gone to Dad. My updated deck had gone to Marissa. The corporate framework contained both. For the first time, I understood that I was not dealing with one person borrowing too much from an old conversation. There had been a path, and my sister was standing somewhere in the middle of it. Marissa agreed to meet me 2 days later, but only after making it clear she thought the meeting itself was ridiculous. She picked a coffee shop halfway between my suburb and hers, the kind of place designed to make every conversation look casual, whether it was or not. Exposed brick, brass pendant lights, tiny marble tables, and music just loud enough to blur the voices around you. I arrived 10 minutes early because I wanted the advantage of sitting down before she came in, not because I was trying to intimidate her. I simply knew myself well enough to understand that if I spent the first 5 minutes looking for somewhere to sit while she talked over me, I would start the conversation irritated instead of focused. Marissa walked in wearing a camel coat over black trousers, her hair pulled back into the low polished knot she wore when she had client meetings. She looked exactly like the version of herself she had spent the last decade building: composed, expensive without being flashy. Someone who understood that presentation started before you said a word. She spotted me, ordered coffee without asking whether I wanted anything, then slid into the chair across from me and put her phone face down on the table. "I have 45 minutes, she said. "Then we shouldn't waste them." She gave me a tired look. "You really are doing this like an interrogation." "No. If this were an interrogation, I'd already know the answers." Her jaw tightened. "See? That tone. I almost let her pull me into it. The familiar argument about how I spoke, how direct I was, how uncomfortable people felt when I did not soften questions for them. For years, my family had treated precision like aggression whenever precision cornered them. I was learning not to defend myself against the accusation. I folded my hands on the table. "Did Dad pay your company to work on the surge framework?" She looked past me toward the counter, then back. "My company has done work for his company." "That isn't what I asked." "I know. Did he pay your company to work on that framework?" "Yes." The answer came faster than I expected. I did not react. "What kind of work?" "Presentation design, executive summaries, visual cleanup, some research support." "What does research support mean?" "It means exactly what it sounds like." "No, it doesn't." Marissa leaned back. "I was given technical materials. I helped turn them into something a boardroom could use." "Given by Dad?" "Mostly." "Did any of those technical materials come from me?" She took a sip of coffee before answering. "Some of them had your name in old file properties." That was the first clean admission she had given me. I felt my pulse change, but I kept my voice level. "You noticed." "Of course I noticed." "And you never asked me." "Asked you what?" "If Dad had permission to use them." Her expression shifted into disbelief. Erica, you had already sent him material. An old version. For feedback. You sent it voluntarily. Yes, and you sent me another version voluntarily. For a community health presentation. I know. Then you also know neither one of those things means I gave Dad permission to present the work as his own. She crossed her arms. You keep saying his own, like he took your name off a finished product and slapped his on it. That isn't what happened. Then tell me what happened. Marissa looked down at the table for a moment. When she spoke again, she sounded less defensive and more like someone explaining a business process to a difficult client. Dad had been talking about surge staffing for years. You gave him an early model. He had his own notes. He had materials from the company. I helped combine things. I reorganized sections. I changed the language. I built the executive deck. There were revisions over time. That's what consulting work looks like. How much of the underlying model did you change? She frowned. That's not my area. Exactly. What is that supposed to mean? It means you were paid to package something you didn't create. That's called consulting. Consultants still know who the client is. My client was Dad's company. No, the company paid you. Dad was the person giving you source material. She looked annoyed again. You're trying to make every sentence sound suspicious. I don't have to. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Somewhere behind me, the espresso machine screamed steam into a metal pitcher. A couple at the next table laughed about something on a phone. I thought about all the ways two sisters can sit across from each other and still be years apart. When Marissa and I were younger, the 5-year age gap between us had felt enormous. By the time I could drive, she was still young enough to believe I knew everything. When Mom and Dad fought, Marissa would knock on my bedroom door instead of theirs. When she was 14 and had a panic attack before a school presentation, I picked her up after practice, bought her fries, and made her give the presentation to me 3 times in the parking lot until she could finish without crying. When she started college and called me from a bathroom because she thought she had chosen the wrong major, I sat on the floor of my own kitchen and talked her through the decision. I did those things because I loved her, not because she owed me later. That distinction mattered. What hurt now was not that I had once protected my sister and failed to collect a debt. What hurt was realizing she had grown accustomed to living inside a system where my contribution became invisible the moment she needed it. You know what I remember? I asked. Marissa's expression changed slightly. What? The fundraiser deck. She exhaled. Here we go. You called me 3 times because you needed a staffing example that didn't use patient data. I sent you the updated model. You told me it was ugly. It was ugly. Despite myself, I almost smiled. You said nurses should be banned from PowerPoint. They should. And then what did you do with that file? She looked away. Marissa. I used parts of it in the fundraiser deck. And after that? I don't know. That isn't true. She leaned forward. Do you know how many files I've touched in the last 10 years? Do you know how many times I've emailed you the surge model? Her face went still. 1, I said. Once. So this isn't some impossible search through 1,000 random documents. She picked up her coffee and put it down again without drinking. Did Dad ask you for it? Yes. The word was quiet. When? I don't remember the exact date. Before or after you used it for the fundraiser? After. Why did he want it? He said he wanted to see the cleaner version. Cleaner than what? His materials. What materials? Erica, stop. No. She looked around the coffee shop as if volume might rescue her. I had not raised mine. He knew I had helped you, she said. He knew I had the updated deck. He asked me to send it. I sent it. That's it. Did you tell him it was mine? He knew. How do you know? Because your name was on it. That answer settled between us. I did not need her to say anything more for several seconds. Then I asked, when did your company start billing his? Marissa's eyes sharpened. Why? Because I'm trying to understand sequence. You're trying to build a case. I'm trying to build a timeline. Same thing. No. A case starts with a conclusion. A timeline starts with dates. She stared at me. You really don't hear yourself, do you? I hear myself fine. You're treating Dad like he's some fraud you discovered at work. I haven't called him a fraud. You don't need to. You're collecting documents, calling his boss, asking about contracts. I called his boss because Dad humiliated me in front of him while standing beside work that looked like mine, and then Grace was sent away minutes after she connected the two. You still think that's why Grace was sent home? I think the timing matters. Marissa shook her head. Dad wanted a business conversation without a 10-year-old interrupting. And sending her to an empty house was the solution? That was wrong. It was the first time she had said it. I stopped. Marissa's face softened for half a second. I know it was wrong. Then why did you leave her? She rubbed one hand over her forehead. Because Dad told me you'd be home soon. You knew I was on a double shift. I knew you were working. I didn't know exactly when you finished. So why didn't you call me? I should have. Why didn't you stay with her? I should have. Her voice cracked slightly on the second admission, then hardened again as if she resented me for noticing. There. Are you happy? No. What do you want me to say? I want you to stop acting like admitting something after the fact means I'm supposed to make the consequences disappear. She looked at me with the same expression she used when we were teenagers, and I had told her something she did not want to hear. That's what this is really about, isn't it? She said. You're punishing everyone because you're mad about Grace. No. Christmas is why I looked. What I found is why I'm still looking. Her mouth tightened. I took out a small notebook. I did not put documents on the table. I did not want her to see every piece I had or turn the meeting into a performance about evidence. I asked only the next question. What was the name of the contract? I don't remember. The project name. I said I don't remember. Was it directly with Dad? My contracts are with entities, not people. Which entity? She named the healthcare staffing company. Was Dad your point of contact? One of them. Who approved your work? Sometimes him, sometimes marketing. Did procurement know you were his daughter? That finally made her pause in a different way. I asumiso. Why? Because it wasn't a secret. That isn't the same thing. What difference does it make? It depends on company policy. She gave me a look of open contempt. You don't work in procurement. No. Then stop pretending you know whether a rule was broken. I'm not saying one was. You're implying it? I'm asking whether the relationship was disclosed. She looked down. I don't know, she said. That was believable. Marissa was good at business, but she was also used to Dad opening doors before she reached them. If Philip told her a vendor setup was fine, she probably had not asked whether some conflict of interest form existed behind the scenes. That did not make her innocent. It made the system around her familiar enough that she had stopped inspecting it. How much did they pay you? I asked. No, I'll probably find out. Then find out. Okay. She blinked, almost disappointed that I had not pushed harder. I closed the notebook. Is that it? She asked. For now. She looked suspicious. You dragged me here for 20 minutes of questions and now you're done? I didn't drag you. You know what I mean. I asked what I needed. She watched me put the notebook back in my bag. You're not going to drop this. No. Even if it ruins Dad? If telling the truth ruins him, I'm not the part of that sentence you should be worried about. Her face went cold. You always have a line ready. No, I just stopped apologizing for finishing a thought. She pushed her chair back, then stopped with one hand on her phone. For what it's worth, you're not going to find some secret folder where Dad wrote, "Here's the thing I stole from Erica." Real work doesn't happen like that. I know. She frowned. I added, that's why I'm looking at the sequence instead. For the first time since she walked in, Marissa looked genuinely unsettled. Then she said something that did not feel important until much later. I still have the old project emails anyway. I keep client records forever. My accountant hates me for it. I looked at her. She immediately seemed to regret saying it. You keep the attachments too? I keep everything. How far back? Years. I nodded once. That's useful. No, it isn't. You're the one who brought it up. Don't what? Don't make that face. What face? The one where you've already filed something away. I did not answer. She grabbed her coat and stood. I have a call. I watched her leave through the front window. She walked fast, shoulders rigid, phone already in her hand. I did not know whether she was calling Mom, Dad, or a client. I did not need to know. I wrote one last note before I left. Marissa retains old client emails and attachments. Then I underlined it once. 3 days later, the review moved from uncomfortable family questions into something that had a $sign attached to it. I was at work when an email from the compliance address appeared in my personal inbox. I did not open it at the nurse's station. I waited until my break and went into a small office used for education meetings. The message asked me to confirm whether I recognized several project descriptions connected to external vendor work associated with the framework. The review team was careful about what they disclosed. They did not send me contracts or someone else's private banking information. What they provided were line-item project titles, time periods, and the name of the vendor relevant to the materials I had already identified. Marissa Nolan Consulting. I stared at the name longer than I should have. The first entry was ordinary enough. Executive Presentation Development. The second, Strategic Communications Support. The third made me sit back. Independent Research Surge Capacity Methodology. There were more. Not millions of dollars, nothing absurd. But enough that I had to stop thinking about Marissa's involvement as a favor to Dad. Across multiple project periods, her company had received tens of thousands of dollars connected to work surrounding the framework. Some charges could easily have represented legitimate presentation services. I did not know otherwise, and I refused to pretend I did. The problem was the label, Independent Research. I opened my source timeline and added a new section, Vendor Path. My first capstone had gone to Dad. My updated deck had gone to Marissa. Dad later received the updated logic. Marissa's company was paid under descriptions that included independent research related to that same methodology. None of that, individually, proved a conspiracy. I knew enough about documentation to resist the seductive version of the story, where every clue was already a conviction. But taken together, the pattern was getting harder to explain as casual family overlap. I emailed compliance back with only what I could support. I identified which project description appeared to correspond to material I had created. I stated that I had never been contracted by the company, never billed for development of that model, and never authorized Marissa or her company to represent my work as independently researched on my behalf. I did not write, my sister stole from me. I did not write, my father committed fraud. Those were conclusions. I sent facts. That distinction mattered to me because my father had already spent years turning language into ownership. I was not going to beat him by becoming careless with language myself. That evening, Marissa called before I had even left the hospital. Did you tell them I stole your work? No. Don't lie to me. I told them exactly what I created, what I sent you, and what I never authorized. They contacted me. I assumed they would. They're asking about invoices from years ago. That sounds like their job. Do you understand what this could do to my business? I leaned against the wall outside the staff elevator and closed my eyes. There it was again. Dad's promotion. Mom's family. Marissa's business. Everyone in my family seemed able to identify the stakes perfectly as long as the stakes belonged to them. Did you invoice Dad's company for independent research related to the Surge framework? I asked. I invoiced according to project categories they gave me. Who gave you the category? I don't remember. You keep every email. Silence. I opened my eyes. You said it yourself, I continued. You keep everything. That doesn't mean I can find one line from years ago in 5 minutes. I didn't ask you to. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you not to tell compliance that I gave you permission to represent my work as independent research. I never said I was going to. Good. She laughed bitterly. You think you're so clean in all of this. I think I'm responsible for what I say. You handed me the file for a community presentation. You handed Dad files too, for feedback. Do you hear how convenient that sounds now? Yes, which is why the emails matter. Family shares things, Erica, not ownership. This is exactly what I mean. You act like everything needs a contract. If somebody is getting paid for work, apparently somebody thought contracts mattered. She went quiet again. Then she said, Dad says all you need to do is clarify that this material moved around inside the family for years. That would calm this down. I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. What does calm this down mean? It means stop making it sound intentional. I haven't said whether it was intentional. You know what they're going to think. That's not my job. You could tell them we all discussed this stuff informally. We did. Exactly. I can also tell them exactly which files I sent, who I sent them to, and why. That's the same thing. No, it isn't. Her frustration sharpened into anger. Why do you have to make everything harder? I thought about Grace alone in my kitchen. I thought about Dad telling everyone I could handle it. I thought about my mother saying families help each other. I thought about Marissa sitting in that coffee shop and asking why credit mattered because I already had a career. Maybe that had been the real bargain in our family all along. Help only counted as love when it moved toward the person who needed more. Once it moved away from me, I was not supposed to keep track of where it went. I'm not making anything harder, I said. I'm just not making it easier by lying. Nobody is asking you to lie. You're asking me to use vague language so people can assume permission that didn't exist. That is not what I said. It is what you're asking me to do. She breathed into the phone for a few seconds. Then her voice softened. Please, Erica. That was harder to hear than anger. For a moment, I saw the 14-year-old Marissa sitting in my passenger seat with a carton of fries in her lap, asking me not to take her home yet because Dad was in a mood, and Mom would only tell her to stay out of his way. I remembered how easy it had once been to protect her. Not because she manipulated me, because she was my little sister, and I loved her. That history did not disappear because she had made bad choices. But history was not permission either. I'm not trying to destroy your business, I said. Then help me. I am helping you by not accusing you of things I can't prove. That isn't help. It's the only kind I'm offering. She did not speak. I will answer exactly what compliance asks me, I continued. No more and no less. I'm not going to speculate about your intent. I'm also not going to say I authorized something I didn't. So you're just going to let them come after me. If they ask you what you did, answer them. You make it sound so simple. No, I make it sound like yours. What? Your responsibility. The silence on the line changed. I had spent so many years stepping into the empty space after somebody else made a bad decision that not stepping into it now felt almost cruel. That was the part I was only beginning to understand about boundaries. They can feel like abandonment when everyone involved is accustomed to you doing the rescuing. Marissa finally said, "You really mean that?" Yes. She hung up without saying goodbye. I stood by the elevator for another minute before moving. My reflection in the metal doors looked more tired than victorious. That mattered too. There was nothing satisfying about watching people you loved panic because the consequences of their choices had finally become visible. Satisfaction would come later, if it came at all. Right then, I mostly felt tired. When I got home, Grace was at the dining table doing a puzzle. She looked up when I walked in and asked if I had brought anything to eat. I told her I had failed as a mother and forgotten dinner. She rolled her eyes in exactly the way 10-year-olds do when they know adults are joking badly, and we ordered soup and sandwiches from a place nearby. While we waited, I opened my laptop at the other end of the table. The vendor review email was still there. Independent Research Surge Capacity Methodology. I looked at the phrase again. Independent. That word bothered me more than the amount. There was nothing independent about the path I could already see. The earliest framework was mine. Dad had received it. Marissa had received an updated version. Dad's company had paid Marissa's business for work surrounding that same methodology. The question was no longer whether my sister had touched my work. She had admitted she had. The question was why the company had been told the research was independent. And somewhere inside years of emails Marissa had just told me she still possessed was the answer. By the third week of January, my father stopped trying to reach me through my mother and sister and asked to see me himself. The message came shortly after 7 on a Tuesday morning, while I was packing Grace's lunch and trying to convince her that 2 granola bars did not count as breakfast. Dad did not call. He texted, "I'd like to talk to you alone." No Henry. No compliance. No Carol. Just us. I read it twice before setting my phone face down on the counter. A month earlier, that message would have pulled at something in me immediately. Dad asking to talk, just us, used to mean the possibility of honesty. By then, I knew better than to confuse privacy with sincerity. I waited until Grace had left for school before answering. I did not ask what he wanted. I did not agree to meet at his house or mine. I suggested a quiet restaurant near his office at 3 that afternoon, early enough that it would be mostly empty and public enough that neither of us could pretend the conversation had happened differently later. I had never been afraid my father would hurt me physically. That was not the issue. I simply no longer wanted important conversations taking place in rooms he controlled. He was already there when I arrived. No suit jacket, no red tie, no leadership award smile. He wore a dark quarter-zip sweater and had a glass of water in front of him. For the first time since Christmas, he looked his age. Not broken, not defeated. Just 63 instead of permanently 45. He stood when I approached, then seemed to reconsider the gesture halfway through and sat again. "Thanks for coming," he said. "You asked." He looked at me for several seconds. "You've always done that." "Done what?" Made everything sound clinical. I almost smiled. "You wanted to talk." He leaned back and rubbed one hand over his mouth. "Fine, let's talk." I waited. That irritated him almost immediately. Dad liked controlling the first interpretation of a situation. Silence forced him to reveal what he had come to sell me. He looked down at the table. I reviewed some of the material they asked me to preserve. "That seems appropriate." "Erika, I'm listening." He sighed. "You contributed to the early model." The sentence was so carefully built that I nearly admired it. "Contributed?" "Yes. I created the original framework." "You created a clinical model. That is the framework." "No, it isn't." His voice sharpened. Then he caught himself and lowered it again. "This is exactly the problem. You're treating what you wrote in a certification program as though someone photocopied it, put my name at the top, and handed me a bonus. That is not what happened." "Then tell me what happened." "I took an academic, clinical concept and made it operational. I gave it structure people outside an ER could understand. I applied it to staffing markets you had never worked in. I brought in people who knew communications, business modeling, client demand. I spent years making it something hospitals could actually buy. I studied him. There it was. Not denial. Ownership through transformation. You think making it marketable made it yours. I think creating value matters. So does creating the thing. You're oversimplifying." "No, I'm separating two contributions." Dad leaned forward. "Without me, your capstone would have stayed in an archive nobody read." "Maybe." He seemed surprised by the answer. I continued, "That still wouldn't make it yours." "You don't know that. I know my name was on it before yours ever was." His eyes hardened. For a few seconds, I could see the conversation splitting in two directions. One path led back to the argument he preferred. Who had made the work more valuable? The other led to the question he had been avoiding since Christmas, why his company believed he had originated it. I chose the second. "What did you tell them about authorship?" He looked away. "Dad." I told them I developed the methodology. "Did you tell them it started with my work?" I told them it came from years of exposure to clinical staffing problems. "That's not what I asked." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "There it is again. Everything has to fit into one of your little boxes." "No, I just don't let you answer a different question." His expression changed. Not anger exactly. Recognition. I had seen that look on people who suddenly realized the conversation would not move just because they pushed harder. He folded his hands on the table. "I should have put your name on it." The restaurant noise around us seemed to drop away. It was not an apology, but it was the closest he had come. For 1 second, I saw the father I had wanted him to be. The man who used to read my papers at the kitchen table. The man who once drove 3 hours to see me receive a nursing leadership certificate and spent the whole trip home telling anyone who would listen that his daughter understood hospitals better than most administrators did. The man whose opinion I had valued enough to send him the first version in the first place. I did not rescue him from the next step. "Then tell Henry." His face closed. The pause lasted long enough that neither of us could pretend he had not heard me. Finally he said, "You know I can't do that." That was the moment the last part of my confusion disappeared. Not because he admitted theft in some dramatic way. Because he admitted knowledge. He knew what the right correction was. He simply did not want to pay the cost of making it. "Why not?" "You know exactly why not." "I want to hear you say it." His jaw tightened. "Because this has gone too far." Too far for what? For a simple correction. You mean too far for you to keep the promotion. He stared at me. I did not need him to answer. Dad leaned back and looked toward the front window. Outside, dirty snow had piled along the curb, gray from traffic and salt. Do you have any idea what happens if I walk into Henry's office now and say the framework started with you? He updates the record. That is not all that happens. No, my promotion disappears. Maybe. My credibility takes a hit. Yes. I could lose my position. Yes. He looked at me sharply. And you can sit there saying that like it means nothing. It doesn't mean nothing. Then why are you doing this? The question came out quieter than everything before it. That mattered. My father was no longer arguing about authorship. He was asking why I would allow consequences to reach him. I thought carefully before answering. I'm not asking them to fire you. You started this. I told Henry I had original files. You knew what that would do. No, I knew what it might cause them to check. That's the same thing. It isn't. To you, maybe. I watched him for a moment. If checking destroys the story you told them, then the checking isn't the problem. His mouth compressed into a line. Then he changed tactics. I knew he was changing. Softened. Erica, I'm trying to find a way through this that doesn't destroy everybody. There was that word. Everybody. Whenever my family wanted me to absorb something, the individual beneficiary disappeared and became everyone. What are you proposing? Dad seemed relieved I had asked. I've spoken to counsel. I lifted an eyebrow. Not company counsel, he said quickly. Personal. Okay. They think the central issue is whether you objected to the use of your material. I didn't know the extent of the use. That is not the same as objecting. It's also not consent. I know. The way he said it told me he had rehearsed this. He leaned closer. You can tell Henry that we exchanged professional materials for years, that you sent me the framework willingly, that I provided development feedback, that you never told me I couldn't use the concepts in my work. Every statement contained enough truth to sound safe. Together, they created a lie. And what happens after I say that? The company closes this down as an internal misunderstanding. You know that? I know it gives them room. For what? To treat this proportionately. I almost smiled at the euphemism. What about Marissa's invoices? His eyes flickered. There are legitimate services behind those invoices. That isn't what I asked. Marissa did real work. I know she did presentation work. She did more than that. Independent research? She had research deliverables. Using materials she got from me? She had multiple sources. Then the company can verify them. He exhaled through his nose. You really are determined to make this as painful as possible. No, I'm determined not to provide the sentence that makes everything easier for you. His expression hardened again. I realized then that the entire meeting had one purpose. Dad did not need my forgiveness. He needed my ambiguity. Not a confession. Not even a lie dramatic enough to feel like one. He needed me to blur the edges until the company could choose not to look too closely. What do I get? I asked. That threw him. What? If this is a negotiation, what are you offering? He studied me suspiciously. I'm offering to fix this. How? I can make sure your contribution is acknowledged privately. I laughed once before I could stop myself. Privately. Don't do that. Do what? Make everything sound dirty. I'm repeating your word. He ignored that. I can make sure Marissa fixes any language that should be fixed. I can speak to your hospital if needed. And after this, we put Christmas behind us. I stared at him. You'll put Christmas behind us. Yes. What does that mean? It means we stop punishing each other over one bad night. My daughter was left alone in an empty house, and I said that was mishandled. No, you said I was making it sound worse than it was. He looked away. I continued, You're offering to forgive me for reacting to something you did. That is not what I said. It's exactly what you said. His frustration returned. Fine, what do you want, Erica? An apology? Money? Your name on a slide? Tell me. That sentence should have made me angrier than it did. Instead, it clarified the gap between us. He still thought the problem was compensation. A thing that could be traded. A concession that could be priced. I want you to tell the truth. I am telling you the truth. Not me. He went still. Tell Henry. His face told me the conversation was over before he stood. He reached for his coat, then looked down at me as though he was still searching for the version of his daughter who would realize what he needed and fix it before he had to ask twice. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand enough. You think being right protects you. No. Then remember this when people start asking questions about your own role. I looked up at him. That was the first moment the conversation felt less like negotiation and more like warning. What role? You sent professional materials outside your hospital. My capstone was mine. Was every piece of it? I said nothing. Dad's eyes held mine for another second. Then he put on his coat. I'm just saying, he added, you should be careful how loudly you accuse people when your own hands may not be as clean as you think. I haven't accused you of anything you can't verify. You know what I mean. I do. He left. I stayed at the table for another 10 minutes. Not because I was shaken. Because I wanted to separate what mattered from what was designed to shake me. Dad had done 3 things. He had admitted I originated substantial portions of the framework. He had refused to correct the record himself. And he had warned me that my hospital might have questions about the material I had shared. The first 2 clarified his motive. The third told me where he might go next. I wrote all 3 down when I got to my car. I did not record the meeting. I had never planned to, and I did not need a secret recording to make the conversation useful. The value was not that Dad had said one magic sentence that would destroy him. The value was that his defense had changed again. First, the framework was his. Then it had been influenced by years of family discussion. Now, I had originated substantial pieces, but he had transformed them. Every new explanation surrendered a little more ground. My mother called that evening. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered because there was one question I wanted to ask her. Did you know? I said before she could begin. Know what? That Dad used my work. She went quiet. Mom, I knew you helped him. No. Did you know he used my model in the framework? He talked about your ideas. That's not what I asked. She made the same tired sound she always made when I refused to accept the softened version. Erica, you and your father talked about work all the time. Did you know he used my model? Yes. The word was so quiet I nearly missed it. I closed my eyes. How much did you know? I knew he had used parts of it. Did you know the company credited him with developing it? I knew he received recognition for it. Did that bother you? What do you want me to say? The truth. You were doing fine. I opened my eyes. She continued before I could respond. You had your career. Your hospital respected you. You had grace. You had your certifications. Your father was finally getting recognized after years of being overlooked. I felt something inside me become very still. So that made it okay? I didn't say that. You just explained why you accepted it. Erica, your father needed this more. There it was. Not a slip. Not a cruel sentence thrown in anger. A belief. My mother genuinely believed need changed ownership. I looked across the kitchen at the refrigerator where Grace had taped a spelling test with a bright blue magnet. 96%. She had been upset about the one word she missed until I told her she had done great. I suddenly remembered my mother saying almost the same thing to me when I was 23 and had gotten my first hospital job. You'll be fine. Your sister needs us more right now. At 26, when Marissa needed money to move after college, you're already established. At 31, when Dad missed one of my professional recognition dinners because Marissa had a client event the same night, you know how proud he is of you. At the time, none of those things had felt large enough to fight over. That was how the system survived. Each individual sacrifice was small enough to swallow. The pattern only became visible when you finally stopped swallowing. Mom, I said slowly, listen to what you just told me. I know what I said. You said Dad needed my work more than I needed credit for my own work. No, I said he needed recognition. Using my work. You keep reducing everything to ownership. Because ownership is the issue. Family is not a courtroom. No, it's apparently a redistribution system. She snapped. That is unfair. To who? To all of us. Again. All of us. I pressed my fingertips against the countertop. Did Dad tell you he met with me today? Yes. Did he tell you what he asked me to do? He said he was trying to reach a compromise. He asked me to tell the company I had effectively given him permission. You did give him the materials. For feedback. You never told him he couldn't use them. That is not permission to erase my name. Erika. No. The word came out sharper than I intended. I lowered my voice. No, I'm not doing this anymore. Doing what? Arguing about whether I'm allowed to object after the fact. You're tearing apart your family over professional credit. No. I'm refusing to lie so Dad can keep a professional story he built without telling the whole truth. Do you hear yourself? Yes. You sound cold. That one landed. It always had. My mother knew exactly where to put the knife. Not selfish, not vindictive, cold. Because I had spent most of my life trying to be the person who could make hard decisions without becoming hard. I looked at the clock. Grace would be home in 20 minutes. I have to go. Please think about what happens if your father loses everything. I almost answered. Then I realized how familiar the question was. Think about what happens to Dad. Think about what happens to Marissa. Think about what happens to Mom. Nobody had asked what happened to me when my work became Dad's achievement. Nobody had asked what happened to Grace when adults decided her mother would figure it out. I have thought about it, I said. That's why I'm not lying. I ended the call. When Grace got home, she dropped her backpack by the door, kicked off one boot, remembered my rule, picked it up, and put it on the mat. I watched her move through the kitchen with the unconscious efficiency of a child who had spent years adapting to a mother with an unpredictable hospital schedule. She opened the refrigerator, checked what was inside, and started making herself a snack without asking. You want help? I asked. I'm good. You sure? She nodded. I can handle it. The words stopped me. Not because 10-year-olds should never make their own snacks. Because of how proud I had always been when she said things like that. Independent. Responsible. My tough girl. I had used those phrases as praise. I suddenly heard my mother saying, "You were doing fine." The difference between me and my mother was not that I had never touched the same pattern. It was that I still had time to interrupt it. I walked over and took the jar of peanut butter from Grace before she could wrestle with the stuck lid. What? She asked. Nothing. I can open it. I know. She gave me a suspicious look. You're my tough girl, I said automatically. Her face softened. I know. That answer hurt. Not because I did not want Grace to be strong. Because I did not want strength to become the rent she paid for being loved. I loosened the lid and handed it back. You know what? What? You don't always have to be. She frowned. Be what? Tough. She looked at me like I had just changed a rule without telling her. I'm not saying fall apart over peanut butter. That made her laugh. I'm saying if something is hard, you're allowed to say it's hard. You don't have to prove you can handle everything. Grace shrugged in the way children do when adults suddenly become serious around sandwiches. Okay. She spread peanut butter on bread. The conversation lasted less than a minute, but I remembered it later. That evening, after Grace was asleep, I opened the factual statement compliance had asked me to complete. I had been putting off the final version because part of me still wanted more certainty. Not emotional certainty. Documentary certainty. I read every line twice. I wrote the date I created the capstone. The date I submitted it. The date I sent the early version to Dad for feedback. The date I sent an updated version to Marissa for the community presentation. I identified which pieces of the corporate framework matched my original work and which later refinement could only have come from the version Marissa received. I stated that Philip had provided useful presentation feedback. That mattered. If I removed his legitimate contribution because I was angry, I would be doing exactly what he had done to me. I stated that I had never entered into a development agreement with Dad's company. I had never licensed my work to them. I had never told Philip he could claim authorship. I had never authorized Marissa to represent the model as independent research. I did not mention Christmas dinner beyond the narrow reason Henry and I had first spoken. I did not write about Dad leaving Grace out. I did not write about Mom's favoritism. I did not write that Philip was a narcissist, a thief, or a liar. I wrote facts. Then I added one final sentence. I am not asking the company to reach any particular employment outcome. I am asking that the provenance and authorship record be evaluated against the documents provided. I read that line 3 times. Then I sent the statement. For the first time since Christmas, I felt calm. Not because I knew how the review would end. I did not. Dad could have been right about one thing. My own hospital might ask questions. There could be policies I had misunderstood years earlier. There could be consequences I had not anticipated. But I knew what I had done that night. I had not detonated anything. I had stopped shielding it. The next morning, I was halfway through reviewing a training schedule when my supervisor appeared in the doorway of the education office. "Erica," she said, "do you have a minute?" Her expression told me this was not about staffing. I closed the file in front of me. "Sure." She stepped inside and shut the door. Then she placed a printed complaint on the desk between us. "Your father contacted the hospital?" My supervisor did not slide the complaint toward me dramatically. She placed it on the desk, sat down across from me, and folded her hands. That made it worse somehow. If she had looked angry, I could have reacted to anger. Instead, she looked careful, which meant the hospital was treating this as a process rather than a personal disagreement. "Before you read that," she said, "I want you to understand that we have not reached any conclusion. But because the complaint involves hospital-related material and an outside company, we have to review it." I nodded and pulled the pages closer. My father's name was on the first page. The complaint was written in the language Dad understood best, formal enough to sound objective, selective enough to tell only one version of the story. He alleged that years earlier I had shared staffing models and operational materials connected to my hospital work with him outside official channels. He suggested that some of those materials might have reflected internal practices and that I was now claiming ownership only because of a family dispute. He did not accuse me of stealing patient records. He was smarter than that. He raised just enough concern about confidentiality, intellectual property, and professional judgment to force the hospital to look. I read the document twice before I spoke. "What exactly are you reviewing?" My supervisor nodded as if that was the question she had hoped I would ask. "The provenance of the materials you shared, whether any hospital-owned or confidential information was included, and whether any policy in effect at the time applied to the documents. We'll also need to understand what was created through your certification program versus what was created here." "That's fair." She watched me for a second. "You're not going to argue?" "I might disagree with the complaint. That doesn't mean the questions are unreasonable." Her expression softened slightly. "Good." I did not feel good. There is a particular kind of fear that comes with having your professional judgment questioned when your profession is one of the things you trust most about yourself. My family could call me cold. They could call me difficult. Dad could say I had ruined Christmas, and Mom could say I had always been too rigid. Those things hurt, but they lived outside the part of my life where I knew exactly who I was. Nursing was different. I had built my adult life on being careful when carelessness could hurt people. Dad knew that. He knew exactly where to aim. My supervisor told me that while the review was open, I would be temporarily removed from a clinical education committee and from one training project tied to staffing policy. I would keep my regular ER role and my pay. No suspension, no disciplinary finding, just a temporary limitation while they verified the complaint. It was reasonable. I hated it anyway. "How long?" I asked. "I don't know yet." "Who's reviewing?" "Clinical compliance, legal, and education leadership. Possibly information security if they need to verify old files." I nodded. She added, "Erica, if there's anything in the history that looks bad but has an explanation, tell us now. Don't make us discover it later." "I won't." That was the first decision I made. The second came 10 minutes later, when I walked back to my desk and found a text from my mother. "Please call me before you say anything at the hospital." I stared at the screen. Then another message appeared. "Your father says this can still be contained." Contained. I had heard that word at work when administrators talked about outbreaks, leaks, staffing failures, and bad publicity. It was a strange word to use about truth, unless truth itself was considered the contamination. I did not call Mom. Instead, I opened the original capstone folder and started making a list of every source document I had used when I created the model. I pulled the syllabus from the nursing leadership program. I found the assignment instructions. I found the de-identification requirements. I found the mock datasets I had built for the capstone and the faculty feedback from the semester. I found the final submission receipt with the timestamp. Then, I found later hospital education materials where pieces of the model had been adapted for internal training after the capstone already existed. That distinction mattered. The original model did not emerge from hospital proprietary data and then get carried home in my bag. It had been built for an academic leadership program using simulated staffing conditions, de-identified operational examples, and general staffing principles. Later, as my career developed, I adapted concepts from it to real training environments. That did not mean every later version belonged to me personally. It meant the complaint had to be separated by date and source, which was exactly what Dad hoped no one would bother doing. By noon, I had a folder organized into 3 categories: what existed before any hospital adaptation, what I later created for hospital education, what I sent Dad and Marissa. I did not hide overlap. I highlighted it. If the review team was going to question me, I wanted them to see the places where the story was complicated before they saw the places where it was clean. I had learned that credibility did not come from pretending nothing messy had ever happened. It came from showing that you were willing to put the messy part on the table yourself. My phone rang while I was scanning an old faculty comment sheet. Dad. Let it ring. A minute later, a voicemail appeared. I did not listen to it immediately. I waited until I was in my car after work. His voice was controlled. Erica. I heard the hospital is reviewing the material. I'm sorry it reached that point. But this is exactly what I warned you about. Nobody wanted this. If you call Henry and clarify that the material was shared voluntarily over the years, I can withdraw my concerns and we can stop doing damage to each other. Think about Grace. Think about your career. This doesn't have to go any further. I listened once. Then I deleted nothing. Not because I intended to use the voicemail as some dramatic piece of evidence. It was not. It did not prove misconduct. It simply confirmed what Dad had been offering since our private meeting. Trade ambiguity for relief. He had found the pressure point and pushed. I was not ashamed to admit it worked for about 15 minutes. I sat in my car with the engine running and imagined the easier version of the week. I call Henry. I say the family had shared ideas informally. I tell hospital compliance the outside use had been misunderstood. Dad withdraws his complaint. The review ends. I return to the education project. Marissa stops calling me vindictive. Mom sleeps better. Maybe Dad's promotion never recovers completely, but the family gets something close to the old arrangement back. There was only one problem. I would have to say something I did not believe was true. Not an obvious lie. Something more dangerous. A sentence vague enough to let everyone else build the lie for me. I turned off the engine. No. If my own record had a problem, the hospital could find it. If I had broken a policy, I would deal with that. I was not going to purchase certainty by giving my father language he could use to erase the difference between access and permission. The next morning, I met with the review team. There were 4 people in the room. My supervisor, a clinical compliance officer, someone from legal, and a director from nursing education. Nobody behaved as though I were on trial. Nobody behaved as though I had already been cleared either. The compliance officer started with the obvious question. Did you send documents related to staffing methodology to your father? Yes. What did you understand those documents to be? A capstone I created in a nursing leadership certification program and later versions based on the same model. Did any of them include patient identifying information? No. Patient census? Not live census data. Internal financial data? No. Vendor information? No. Hospital staffing ratios? Not in the original capstone. Some later education slides reflected generalized staffing examples, but not unit-level operational reports or protected patient information. The attorney looked up. Do you have those versions separated? Yes. I handed over the index I had prepared. The education director glanced through it and looked at me. You did this overnight? I already had most of the files organized. I added the source distinctions. She nodded. The questions continued. When did I send the first version to Dad? Why? Did he ask for it? No. I asked for presentation feedback. Did he return comments? Yes. Did I use some of those comments? Yes. Did I later give Marissa an updated version? Yes. Why? For a community health presentation where she needed a generic visual example. Did I authorize her to use it for a corporate client? No. Did I explicitly tell her she could not? No, because that was not the purpose of the exchange. I saw the attorney write something down. I did not panic. People sometimes mistake being questioned for being accused. I had worked too long in medicine to make that error. If a fact could be uncomfortable, it was better to say it cleanly than spend 10 minutes dancing around it and make everyone wonder why. After nearly an hour, the compliance officer asked, "Did you believe the hospital owned the original capstone?" "No." "Why?" "Because it was created for an outside certification program before the hospital ever adapted any part of it for internal education. I used simulated and de-identified examples. I did not build the original from proprietary hospital reports. Did anyone here authorize you to share later adaptations? That's what I want you to review." That answer made the room quiet for a moment. I could have tried to protect myself by insisting every version was obviously mine. I did not know that yet. The truth was more specific. The original model had a clean academic provenance. Later versions required closer review. If I wanted my father's claims judged precisely, I had to accept the same precision applied to me. The legal representative nodded. That's a fair distinction. The meeting ended without drama. No one took my badge. No one escorted me out. I went back to the ER and worked the rest of my shift. That evening, Grace was doing homework at the kitchen table when she noticed the folder I had brought home. "Are you in trouble?" she asked. I looked at her. "Why do you think that? You keep bringing work papers home." I sat down across from her. "Some people at the hospital are checking something I did a long time ago." Her eyes widened. "Because of Grandpa?" "Partly." She pushed her math worksheet aside. "Because I said the thing about the chart?" There it was again. The guilt. Children are efficient that way. Give them a series of events, and they will often put themselves in the center, even when they had no power over any of it. "No." "But you called Mr. Sloan after I said it." "Yes." "So if I didn't say it—" "Grace." She stopped. I reached across the table and took her pencil out of her hand so she would look at me. "You noticed something." She nodded. "You didn't create the documents. You didn't send them. You didn't make Grandpa use anything. You didn't decide what his company was told. You didn't decide what Aunt Marissa invoiced. All of those choices happened before Christmas." She looked down. "I just pointed it out." "Exactly. Grandpa thinks I caused it." "Did he tell you that?" "No." "Then don't borrow thoughts from people who haven't said them." She looked back at me. I realized how often adults did exactly that. My mother had spent years telling me what Dad must have meant. Marissa told me what everyone was going to think. Dad told me what Henry would conclude. Entire family systems can survive on people reacting to assumptions instead of statements. "Do you think you caused it?" Grace asked. "No." She considered that. "Do you think I did?" "Absolutely not." That seemed to settle something for her. She picked up her pencil again. I started to stand. Then she said, "Mom?" "Yes?" "Are they going to fire you?" The question hurt because I did not know. "I don't think so." "That's not the same as no." I smiled despite myself. "You've been listening to me too much." "Probably." I sat back down. "I don't know exactly what will happen, but I told them everything I have, and I'm going to answer their questions honestly." "Are you scared?" There are moments when parents want so badly to sound invincible that we accidentally teach children fear is shameful. I almost said no. Instead, I said, "A little." Grace nodded as though that made more sense. "Okay." That was all. 3 days later, the hospital review team asked me back. This meeting felt different. Not friendlier. More focused. The clinical compliance officer had a printed comparison packet in front of her. "We've separated the original capstone from later hospital adaptations," she said. "Based on what we've reviewed so far, we are not seeing patient-identifiable information in the materials you sent your father. We're also not seeing evidence that the original capstone was created as hospital-owned work product." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. She raised one hand slightly. "We are still reviewing a small number of later slides for internal policy questions. I don't want you to hear this as a final clearance." "I understand." The nursing education director added, "But the core allegation that you handed an outside party confidential patient data or an internal proprietary staffing system is not supported by what we've seen." That was enough for the moment. My shoulders loosened. Then the attorney slid a page toward me. "There is something else." The chart on the page looked familiar at first. Red and blue blocks, escalation levels, a section of the framework. Then I saw the numbers. Projected reduction in vacancy response time, decrease in overtime dependence, improvement in cross-unit staffing coverage. Several percentages were attached to what the corporate material called pilot results. I read them twice. What am I looking at? The attorney tapped the heading. These appear in the corporate version associated with your father's framework. We're trying to determine whether these results were based on work you did here. No. You're sure? Yes. The compliance officer leaned forward. Take your time. I don't need time. I pointed to the first figure. I never measured that. Then the second. I never ran a pilot across multiple facilities. The third. I wouldn't even define the outcome this way. The nursing education director frowned. Why not? Because it combines two different staffing effects into one percentage. I wouldn't report it like that. They exchanged glances. I looked back at the page. For the first time since the review began, I felt my fear move away from myself. These aren't mine, the attorney asked. Could they have come from an internal hospital adaptation of your model? Not one I created. Could another team here have generated them? Possibly. You'd have to check. The compliance officer turned another page. There were references to a regional pilot cohort. I frowned. What? I pointed to it. That wasn't part of my capstone. The attorney said, We know. I looked up. How? Because your original submission is time-stamped, and these claims don't appear in any of the versions you gave us. A quiet settled over the room. I understood what they were doing. They were not clearing Dad. They were separating source layers. The original model could be traced to me. The later corporate performance claims could not. My father had tried to make the entire framework my possible misconduct problem. Instead, the review had started dividing it into pieces, and one of those pieces now had no owner. I asked, where did these results come from? The compliance officer closed the packet. That's what we're trying to determine. I looked at the numbers one more time. They were polished, specific, confident, exactly the kind of numbers executives loved because they turned a complicated system into a clean promise. Dad had always been better at clean promises than I was. I preferred caveats, limitations, ranges, the annoying little details that kept a good-looking number from becoming a lie. The attorney gathered the pages into a folder. We may need to speak with you again. That's fine. As I stood, the nursing education director said, Erica? I turned. For what it's worth, bringing us the source material instead of trying to manage the review helped. I nodded. Thank you. I walked out of that meeting relieved about my own position and more uneasy about Dad's than I had been before. For weeks, I had been asking whether Philip had taken too much credit for something I created. That question suddenly felt smaller, because if the framework now contained performance claims that neither I nor my hospital had produced, then someone had added more than presentation language. Someone had added evidence, or something designed to look like it. By the time I reached the elevator, my phone buzzed. It was a message from the compliance contact reviewing Dad's company. We need to compare notes on the validation section. Can you confirm those pilot figures did not originate with you? I typed back immediately. Confirmed. I did not create them, calculate them, or provide them. 3 dots appeared. Then another message. Understood. We have the same question you do. I stared at the screen. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside. For a month, my father had insisted I was making trouble by asking where his framework came from. Now 2 separate review teams were asking a question he could not blame on Christmas, family loyalty, or my anger. If those numbers had not come from me, then where had they come from? The answer did not come quickly. For the next several days, the validation section sat in the middle of 2 different reviews, like an object nobody wanted to touch until they understood who had put it there. My hospital was still finishing its own source analysis. Dad's company was comparing the corporate framework against older internal records, vendor files, and whatever Philip had submitted during earlier promotion cycles. I was not copied on most of that, and I did not ask to be. By then, I had learned that knowing every detail was not the same thing as having control. My job was to answer what I actually knew and stay out of the parts I did not. What I did know was simple. The percentages in the validation section had never come from my capstone. They had never come from a pilot I ran. They had never come from any hospital project I had supervised. The language surrounding them was also wrong in a way that bothered me professionally. It treated several different staffing outcomes as though they could be collapsed into one clean performance story. That was exactly the kind of thing I warned younger nurses about when they started presenting quality data. A number could be technically real and still misleading if you stripped away the conditions that gave it meaning. On Monday afternoon, Henry's office asked if I could join a formal video meeting the following day. The invitation came through the company's review channel, not his personal number. The difference mattered. Christmas Eve had begun as an awkward family dinner. By January, every important conversation had moved into rooms where people took notes. I accepted. The meeting included Henry, a compliance director I had spoken with twice before, and one attorney from the company. Henry looked different from the man I remembered at my parents' table. No wine glass. No Christmas sweater from his wife draped over the back of his chair. He was wearing a dark suit and reading from a packet on his desk. "Thank you for making time," he said. "We want to clarify a technical issue before we continue reviewing the validation claims." Okay. The compliance director shared a slide. I recognized the structure immediately. Red pressure zones, blue support zones, 3 escalation levels. Then she highlighted a section on the right side of the screen. Henry asked, "If one hospital is showing red pressure, but the neighboring facility is showing blue capacity, what prevents a direct reassignment?" I answered before I had time to think about why he was asking me instead of Dad. Skill mix, actual availability, and timing. Blue capacity does not mean transferable capacity. If the available nurses are in the wrong specialty, already committed to high acuity patients, or too far into another shift structure, the capacity exists on paper but not operationally. Henry nodded once. What else? Transport and onboarding rules if you're crossing facilities. Credentialing if the system isn't unified. Sometimes union or scheduling constraints. Also, moving people too aggressively can turn the blue facility red 30 minutes later. The attorney wrote something down. Henry asked, "Would you ever treat the map as a simple balancing problem?" No. Why? Because people aren't inventory. That came out more sharply than I intended. Henry did not seem offended. He looked at the slide again. That's what I thought. I waited. He asked one more question, this time about the sequence of the escalation logic. I explained why the model separated staffing pressure from actual deployable support and why the decision order mattered. It took maybe 3 minutes. When I finished, the compliance director stopped sharing the screen. Henry folded his hands. "I want to tell you something about Christmas Eve." I felt my shoulders tighten, not because I expected a revelation, because by then, I had learned that almost every new piece of information made an older memory worse. Henry continued. "Before your father called you that night, we had already been discussing this framework for close to an hour." I said nothing. "He's been under consideration for an expanded operations role. Part of that review involves understanding how much of this methodology he personally developed and how well he can defend it." That was the first time anyone had explained why the framework mattered so much to the promotion. I had known it was connected. I had not known the connection was that direct. Henry glanced toward the compliance director, then back at me. I asked him the same first question I just asked you. My stomach tightened. What did he say? He answered at a much higher level. I almost smiled despite myself. That was a polite executive way to describe avoiding a question. Henry went on. He talked about dynamic deployment, regional elasticity, centralized visibility, all valid phrases. He did not explain the operational constraint I was asking about. I knew exactly what Dad had done. I had watched him do it my whole life. If he did not know a narrow answer, he widened the conversation until the other person forgot the original question. Henry said, "Then your mother mentioned that you worked in emergency nursing education." I remembered. The glass award behind Dad, Henry asking me about surge mapping, Dad interrupting. The joke about outsourcing grace. At the time, I had categorized the whole thing as one more example of my father needing to be the smartest person in the room. Henry continued. "I said I would be interested in your perspective. And that's when he called me. Yes, I looked away from the screen for a second. A month earlier, that Christmas call had felt humiliating because Dad had made a joke out of my motherhood in front of his boss. I had thought he was showing off. I had thought Henry's presence made Dad crueler because Philip liked audiences. That interpretation had been incomplete. Henry said, "I didn't think much of it at the time. Families have odd ways of talking to each other. But when I asked you about the framework, your father immediately shifted the conversation toward your schedule, your personal life, and your reliability." The word sat there. Reliability. Not expertise. Not authorship. Reliability. I replayed the call in my head. She can manage a trauma floor. She just can't manage Christmas without outsourcing the kid. At the time, I heard insult. Now I heard preparation. If I later said Dad's framework looked like mine, Henry would already have a story waiting for him. Erica was chaotic. Erica overreacted. Erica could not manage her own household. Erica was emotional because she worked too much. Dad had not needed Henry to believe I was incompetent clinically. He only needed Henry to wonder whether I was credible personally. I leaned back in my chair. He was discrediting me before I said anything. Nobody answered immediately. The compliance director finally said, "We can't speak to his state of mind." I know. That distinction mattered. They could not tell me what Philip had intended, but they had given me timing, and timing was enough for me to form my own conclusion. Henry said, "What I can tell you is that the shift in conversation was noticeable in hindsight." I nodded. There are insults that hurt when they happen, and then there are insults that become worse after you understand what they were for. That one belonged to the second category. Dad had used things that were true about my life. I did work long hours. I was divorced. I did rely on carefully arranged childcare. I had missed holidays. I had asked my parents for help with Grace when the ER blew up unexpectedly. None of those things made me unreliable. But they were real enough that, arranged correctly, they could become a story. Philip understood stories better than I did. That was one of his actual talents. He knew facts did not have to be false to be weaponized. I had spent years believing competence would protect me from that. If I worked hard enough, documented carefully enough, showed up consistently enough, then what people said would not matter. Dad knew better. People often judge the document after they judge the person holding it. I hated admitting that he understood that before I did. Henry pulled me out of the thought. "There's another reason we wanted to speak today." The compliance director shared a different page. It was a summary, not the full internal file. The validation claims were listed beside source categories. Some had supporting operational records. Some did not. Several could be traced only to later versions of the framework and presentation material prepared during the period when Marissa's company was doing outside work. I read the page carefully. "Are you saying Marissa created the numbers?" "No," the compliance director said. "We are not saying that." I appreciated the correction. "We have not established who originated every claim. We are establishing who received, reviewed, approved, or presented them." That was smarter. Dad had spent weeks trying to make authorship the entire issue. But authorship and accountability were not identical. Even if somebody else had typed a number, an executive could still be responsible for putting that number into a promotion file or client presentation as though it were validated. Henry said, "Your father represented the framework as supported by successful multi-site application. We are reviewing the basis for that representation." "Did he sign something?" The attorney answered, "There are certifications associated with the promotion packet and with certain internal representations. We're reviewing exact language." I nodded. That was all they could reasonably tell me. I did not need them to turn it into a prosecution speech. The stronger the case became, the less dramatic the language around it got. That felt appropriate. The compliance director then asked, "Is there anything else about your father's professional conduct or use of your work that you believe we should know?" I knew what she meant. It was an opening, and for a moment I understood how easy it would be to abuse it. I could have told them every cruel thing Dad had ever said, how he minimized my work at family dinners, how Mom always rearranged events around Marissa, how he had left Grace out of Christmas dinner, how he had implied my career might not survive scrutiny, how he had asked me to clarify permission after the fact. Some of those things were relevant emotionally. Most were not relevant to the narrow professional questions in front of them. I thought about Christmas morning, when Dad accused me of trying to ruin him. If I dumped our entire family history into that meeting, I would be helping him make his favorite defense. This was personal. This was revenge. This was a bitter daughter using his company to settle old scores. I was not going to give him that. There are family issues, I said. But unless you ask me something that connects directly to the documents, I don't think they belong in your review. Henry watched me carefully. The compliance director nodded. That's fair. I added, if you need clarification about something he said to me concerning the framework, ask me specifically. I'll answer. That was all. The meeting ended 20 minutes later. I sat at my desk after the screen went dark and stared at my reflection in the black monitor. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt sad. That surprised me, not because Dad had been exposed, because Henry's explanation reached backward and changed a memory I had already filed away. On Christmas Eve, I had still believed my father's worst habit was needing to feel superior. I now believed something uglier. He had been afraid of me. Not physically, not even socially. Professionally, he had spent years acting as though my work was too narrow, too clinical, too buried in the chaos of emergency medicine to matter outside my hospital. Yet the moment a man with power showed genuine interest in what I knew, Dad had not encouraged the conversation. He had tried to make me smaller. That told me more about what he believed my expertise could expose than any compliment ever had. On the drive home, I thought about the first time I had sent him my capstone. I remembered checking my email too often because I wanted his feedback. I remembered how proud I felt when he called and said, "There's something here." At the time, I thought he meant there was something in me. Years later, I understood he might already have been looking at the work differently. I did not know exactly when admiration became entitlement. That part may never have had a clean date. Maybe Dad had admired the model sincerely at first. Maybe he had reused one idea, then another. Maybe each step felt small enough to justify until one day his name was on top and mine was nowhere. People like to imagine betrayal as a single decision. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is 20 small permissions a person gives himself until he no longer remembers there was ever a line. That evening, Mom called. I answered because I was waiting for Grace to finish showering and did not feel like letting her fill my voicemail again. "Henry spoke to you today," she said. It was not a question. "How do you know?" "Your father knows there was another interview. I'm not discussing the review with you." "Erica, please." "No. He's barely sleeping." I said nothing. "He has worked his entire life for this." "I know. You keep saying that like it doesn't matter." "It matters." "Then act like it." I closed my eyes. There was a time that sentence would have pulled me immediately into defense. How should I act? What did Mom want me to fix? Who needed me to make things easier? Instead, I asked, "Has Dad told you what they're reviewing now?" Silence. "Mom? I know they're looking at old documents." "Did he tell you about the validation claims?" "I don't know what that means." "That sounded true." I let it go. She lowered her voice. "Your father says they're trying to make every normal business decision look suspicious. Then the records should help him." "You always say that." "Because it's true. Documents don't explain relationships. This review isn't about relationships. To you, maybe." I almost ended the call. Then Mom said something that made me stay. "Your father told them you always knew he used your work." I sat straighter. "What?" "He said you talked about it for years, that it was understood." "Did he tell them you could confirm that?" Another pause. "Mom, he said everyone in the family knew there was overlap." That explained something. If Philip's defense was implied permission through family sharing, Carol was not just his wife. She was potentially a witness to the story he wanted the company to believe. "Did anyone from his company contact you?" Her silence answered before her words did. "Yes." "When?" "Yesterday." "What did you tell them?" "I told them what I remembered." "What do you remember?" "Erica, I'm not doing another one of your question and answer sessions. You just told me you spoke to an investigator in a corporate review involving work I created." "I told them you and your father discussed work all the time." "That's true." "I told them you sent him things." "That's true." "I told them I knew he used some of your ideas." My grip tightened around the phone. "How long have you known that?" "I don't know." "Years?" She sighed. "Probably." That was not the same as what she had told me earlier. Earlier, Mom had admitted she knew Dad had used parts of my work. This was broader, longer, potentially much more specific. What exactly did you tell the investigator? Why does it matter? I didn't say anything against you. I stood and walked toward the kitchen window. Outside, the streetlights reflected off old snow piled along the curb. I'm not asking whether you said something against me. Then what are you asking? What did you tell them you knew Dad had done? She sounded suddenly guarded. I need to go. Mom. I said what I remembered. The line disconnected. I stared at the phone. For a few seconds, I considered calling back. I did not. If Carol had told the company something important, the company could tell me if and when it became relevant. I was finished chasing people through half-confessions. The next morning, Henry's office asked for a brief follow-up call. I joined from a private room at the hospital. Only Henry and the compliance director were there. Henry looked tired. So there's one more issue we need to clarify, he said. I waited. He glanced down at his notes. Your mother spoke with our investigator yesterday. I know. Henry looked back at the camera. She told us she knew your father had been using your work in connection with the framework for years. I did not call my mother the moment Henry told me what she had said. A month earlier, I would have. I would have needed to know what she meant, whether Henry had misunderstood her, whether Dad had pressured her, whether there was some softer explanation that would let me keep the version of my family I had carried for years. By then, I understood that urgency was one of the ways my family kept me inside their system. Somebody said something hurtful, somebody else panicked, and I rushed in to translate, repair, and absorb. So I finished my shift first. I picked Grace up. I made dinner. I helped her study spelling words. Only after she was upstairs getting ready for bed did I text my mother and ask if she could come over the next afternoon. Carol arrived carrying a casserole. That was so completely my mother that I almost laughed. She stood on my porch holding a glass baking dish wrapped in a towel and said, I thought you could use dinner tomorrow. I stepped aside to let her in. Put it in the refrigerator. She did, then spent almost a full minute adjusting the towel around the dish as if the arrangement mattered. I waited at the kitchen table. There was no laptop open, no binder, no printed emails. I had deliberately removed all of it. I did not want her to believe this conversation was another evidence review. I wanted one answer from my mother, and I wanted to know whether she could give it without me proving anything first. She finally sat across from me. You spoke to Henry's investigator, I said. Her shoulders stiffened. I spoke to someone from the company. What did you tell them? I already told you. You told me you said Dad had used some of my ideas. Henry says you told them you knew he had been using my work for years. Carol looked toward the living room. Those statements aren't contradictory. No, they aren't. That seemed to bother her more than if I had accused her of lying. I waited. She folded her hands. What do you want from me, Erica? The truth without translation. I don't know what that means. Yes, you do. Her eyes narrowed. You always think you're the only person in the room who understands what's really happening. That's not what I said. You may not say it, but that's how you act. There it was again. The shift away from the question and toward my tone, my personality, the way I made people feel when I refused to move off the facts. I recognized it now. That made it less effective. How long did you know Dad was using my work? She exhaled slowly. I knew he used parts of it. For how long? I don't remember. Before the company started calling it the Nolan Surge Framework? I don't know. Before he got the award? Her gaze dropped. That was my answer. I leaned back in the chair. I did not feel the explosion of anger I would have expected. Mostly I felt tired. You knew before the award. I knew he had used some things you worked on. Did you know the company thought he developed the framework? I knew they credited him. And you never asked why my name wasn't there? She looked at me then, almost offended. You never seemed to care. That sentence hit differently now because Marissa had said almost the same thing. You decided I didn't care. You were busy. You had your own career. That isn't an answer. You didn't talk about corporate recognition. You weren't chasing executive titles. Your father was. And that made my work available? No. Then explain it to me. Her face tightened. Your father had spent years being overlooked. People took his work for granted. He was finally getting somewhere. Finally being treated like someone whose ideas mattered. I stared at her. She heard herself too late. Whose ideas? I asked. Carol closed her eyes. Mom, I didn't mean it that way. You did. No, I meant he was good at making the model usable. So was I. For a hospital. That was the point. You know what I mean. I know exactly what you mean. She stood abruptly and walked to the sink. For a few seconds, she stared out the window at the backyard, where the last patches of dirty snow were shrinking along the fence. You were doing fine, she said. I had heard those words before. They still hurt. You said that already. Because it's true. What does that have to do with what he took? You had stability. You had your position at the hospital. You had grace. Even after the divorce, you kept moving forward. Your father needed this more. There it was again. Not a mistake. Not an unfortunate phrase. A principle. I got up and walked toward her, but I stopped on the other side of the kitchen island. You keep saying needed like it changes ownership. I'm saying life isn't always equal. No, I agree. She turned. Then why can't you understand? Because unequal isn't the same as mine becoming his. Her eyes filled with frustration. You make everything so transactional. I'm not asking him to pay me back for every family dinner. I'm asking why everyone in this family thought my work belonged to the person who needed it more. That is not what happened. Then what happened? She opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For most of my life, that would have been the point where I helped her. I would have offered possibilities. Maybe Dad didn't realize. Maybe Mom didn't know how far it went. Maybe Marissa thought the company already understood. I would have constructed a bridge and invited everyone to cross it toward a kinder version of themselves. I did not do that. Carol finally said, families help each other. Only when the help is voluntary. You gave him the material. For feedback. You gave Marissa material too. For a presentation. You never said they couldn't use it elsewhere. I stared at her. You really believe silence is permission. I believe families don't operate with contracts between every conversation. Neither do I. Then what are we doing? Figuring out where helping ended and taking started. Her voice sharpened. And who gets to decide that? You? When it's my work, yes. She looked as if I had said something cruel. That was the part I had trouble understanding even then. My mother could tolerate almost any imbalance as long as it was explained as love. The moment I used the word mine, she heard selfishness. I thought back over years of small moments that had never seemed important enough to catalog. When I got my first raise, Mom asked me to lend Marissa money for a deposit because you're doing better right now. When Dad missed one of my professional dinners because Marissa had an event the same night, Mom told me, you know you don't need him there the way she does. When my marriage was failing, I did not tell them for months because Marissa was launching her business and everyone was already stressed. Nobody ordered me to stay quiet. That was the problem. I had learned the rule so well I enforced it on myself. The capable person could absorb more. The stable person could wait. The strong person did not need acknowledgement. I had spent years being proud that I was the strong one. It had never occurred to me that the title came with an invoice. Do you know what Dad said after Marissa left Grace alone? I asked. Mom crossed her arms. He said I'd figure it out. I'm sure he didn't mean, don't. She stopped. Please don't tell me what he meant. I know what he said. Grace was safe. I felt the last of my patience leave. No. Carol flinched. She became safe because I made calls from the ER, and Mrs. Palmer went to get her. That is not the same thing. She was alone for a very short time. You don't get to grade it afterward. I'm not grading anything. You are. You keep telling me the ending means the decision was acceptable. That isn't what I'm saying. It is exactly what you're saying. She shook her head. I would never intentionally put Grace in danger. I believe you. That stopped her. I continued. I don't think you wanted anything bad to happen. I think you assumed I would fix it. Carol looked away. And you were right, I said. I did. She sat back down slowly. For the first time in the conversation, she looked less defensive than sad. Erica, what do you want me to say? I thought about it. For years I had imagined there must be one sentence that would make old hurts settle into place. Some admission from Mom that she had favored Marissa. Some apology from Dad for turning me into the child who could handle anything. some acknowledgement that strength was not the same as having fewer needs. But sitting there, I realized I did not actually need the sentence anymore. "I don't want you to say anything you don't believe." She looked surprised. "I want you to stop telling me what I'm allowed to call serious." "I've never—" "You have." Christmas was a misunderstanding. Grace was safe in the end. Dad only used parts of my work. Marissa was just helping. Every time something happens, you reduce it until it fits inside whatever version of this family you need to protect. Her eyes filled. "I'm trying to keep us together." "At whose expense?" She stared at me. I did not answer for her. That mattered. Finally, she whispered, "You think everything is my fault now?" "No." "Then why are you doing this to me?" "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm changing what I participate in." Her face hardened again. "Meaning?" "Grace won't be staying with you or Dad alone for now." She pushed her chair back. "You're keeping my granddaughter from me." "No." I said no unsupervised childcare. Because of one night? Because after that night, neither of you took responsibility for the decision. We have apologized. You apologized that she was upset. That's not fair. Maybe not. It's still my decision. You're punishing us. No. I'm changing a childcare arrangement because I no longer trust the judgment behind it. That was the difference I wanted her to understand. I was not banning phone calls. I was not telling Grace she could never see her grandparents. I was not using my daughter as leverage to make them confess. I was simply refusing to hand over responsibility for Grace to people who still believed leaving her alone had become acceptable because someone else fixed it quickly. Mom picked up her purse. "You'll regret how far you've taken this." I almost answered. Then I remembered how many times she had predicted my regret whenever I stopped doing what the family needed. I let the sentence sit there. She left without taking the casserole back. Grace came downstairs 10 minutes later. "Grandma mad?" "She's upset." "With you?" "Probably." Grace walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. "Can I have some of the casserole?" I looked at her and laughed. "What?" "Nothing. Yes." She pulled the dish out carefully and set it on the counter. I helped her serve a portion. Then we sat at the table together while she told me about a science project she had been paired on with a boy who apparently believed writing his name on the poster counted as 50% of the work. The irony was almost too obvious, so I kept it to myself. A few nights later, I noticed Grace carrying a dining chair from the wall toward the table. We were having dinner with Mrs. Palmer and her daughter. Nothing formal. Soup, bread, a salad Grace refused to touch until I reminded her that lettuce did not become poison because it was January. "Why are you bringing that?" I asked. Grace set the chair beside the table. "In case there isn't room." Everyone went quiet. Grace did not seem to notice. She started arranging forks. I looked at the chair. One small extra chair. That was all. But I suddenly understood that Christmas had changed something inside her in a way I had not seen yet. "There's already enough room," I said. "I know. Then why the extra chair?" She shrugged. "Just in case." I wanted to tell her immediately that Grandma and Grandpa had been wrong, that there would always be room for her, that nobody could make her believe otherwise. But sweeping promises are easy. Children notice systems more than speeches. So I walked over, pulled the extra chair into place and said, "Okay, then we'll keep an extra one." Grace nodded as if the issue were solved. Later, after Mrs. Palmer left, Grace helped me clear the table. She picked up 4 plates at once. "You can take 2 trips," I said. "I've got it." "I know. I can handle it." I looked at her hands wrapped around the stack. There it was again. The phrase I had once loved. My tough girl. I took 2 plates off the top. "Hey." She looked at me. "You don't always have to." "Have to what?" "Handle everything." She rolled her eyes. "It's plates, Mom." "I know. Are you being weird again?" "Yes." She smiled. I smiled back. The moment was ordinary. That was why it mattered. Breaking a family pattern did not always look like a confrontation across a table. Sometimes it looked like taking 2 plates out of a 10-year-old's hands before she learned that love meant proving she could carry all 4. The next week, compliance requested one final written clarification from me before the formal review meeting. I went through my files again, but this time I noticed something different about myself. I was no longer searching for the perfect argument that would force my parents to agree with me. I did not need Dad to call it theft. I did not need Mom to admit she had chosen his needs over mine. I did not need Marissa to understand why "family doesn't keep score" sounded different when money had been invoiced under her company name. They were allowed to keep whatever story they needed. The documents did not need their permission. I submitted the clarification and closed the folder. 2 days later, an email arrived from the compliance director. The subject line was simple: "Formal review meeting attendance confirmed." I opened it. Henry would be there. The compliance lead, company counsel, me, Philip Nolan, and Marissa Nolan. For several seconds, I stared at my sister's name. Then I thought about the old emails she had told me she never deleted. For the first time since Christmas, I wondered whether the person my father had spent years protecting might be the person he should have been most afraid to corner. The formal review meeting took place on a gray Monday morning at the beginning of March, in a conference room on the 6th floor of my father's company headquarters. By then, I had stopped expecting important moments to look dramatic. There was no long mahogany table, no line of executives waiting to condemn anyone, no security guard at the door. The room had beige walls, a screen at one end, a carafe of coffee nobody touched, and the kind of rolling office chairs that squeaked whenever someone shifted their weight. Henry sat near the head of the table with the compliance director and company counsel. My father sat 2 seats away from him. Marissa was across from me. I had brought one binder containing copies of the documents I had already submitted and a notebook with my source timeline. That was all. Dad looked polished again. Dark suit, white shirt, silver tie. If you had walked into the room without knowing why we were there, you would have assumed he was the most senior person present after Henry. That was one of Philip's real strengths. He understood how appearance shaped expectation. He knew how to sit as if he belonged at the center of a conversation, even when the conversation was about whether he had earned the right to be there. Marissa looked different. She had dressed professionally, but there was none of her usual ease. Her laptop was open in front of her. She kept one hand near the trackpad and the other wrapped around a paper cup she never lifted. We had not spoken since the meeting notice went out. I had considered calling her, then decided against it. Whatever she knew, whatever she planned to say, needed to belong to her. The compliance director opened by explaining what the meeting was and, just as importantly, what it was not. This was not a court proceeding. Nobody was being asked to make a criminal admission. The company was trying to complete an internal review concerning the development history of the Surge framework, the accuracy of representations connected to it, the use of an outside vendor, and the validation claims that had appeared in later materials. Everyone would have a chance to respond to specific documents. Dad nodded before she finished, as if the process itself confirmed his confidence. When she asked whether he wanted to make an initial statement, he said yes. "I think this has grown far beyond what actually happened," he began. "Erica and I discussed healthcare staffing for years. She shared materials with me voluntarily. I gave her feedback. I continued developing ideas in my professional role, with input from internal teams and outside consultants. There was never a secret appropriation of anyone's work." His voice was calm. If I had not spent weeks comparing dates, I might have found the explanation reasonable. Dad continued. Marissa was retained through her business to provide communications, research support, and executive presentation services. She handled source consolidation and vendor deliverables. I did not personally manage every document she received or every coding decision associated with her invoices. Marissa looked up, only for a second. Then she looked back at her laptop. That was the first moment I felt the shape of what Dad was building. He was creating distance. From me, he was distancing himself by calling my files family shared material. From Marissa, he was distancing himself by calling her an independent vendor who handled the implementation details. The attorney asked, "Were you aware that the original capstone was authored by Erica?" "Yes." "Were you aware that the updated version used in later framework materials had also originated with Erica?" Dad paused. I was aware she had continued working on similar concepts. That wasn't my question. It was strange, hearing someone else use almost the exact sentence I had used with him so many times. Dad shifted in his chair. "I knew she had updated materials." "Did you know Marissa received those updates from Erica?" "I understood there had been exchanges between them." Marissa's hand stopped moving on the trackpad. The compliance director placed a document on the screen. It was my original submission receipt, followed by the email I had sent Dad years earlier asking for presentation feedback. She asked him whether he disputed either date. No. Then came the company's own development timeline showing when Philip had first represented the framework as something he was building internally. He did not dispute that either. Then the updated deck I had sent Marissa appeared. Then the later corporate slide containing the refinement that had never been included in the version I gave Dad. The sequence was not theatrical. That was what made it effective. Each document simply narrowed the number of explanations left. Dad leaned forward. Nobody is denying that Erica contributed material. The compliance director said, earlier statements described your role as developing the methodology. I did develop it. From her model? From multiple inputs. Which inputs? Clinical conversations, staffing data, market research, operational experience. Can you identify the source material that predates Erica's capstone and contains the same underlying decision structure? Dad looked toward company counsel. The attorney did not help him. I don't have every archival document memorized, Dad said. No one expects you to. The compliance director moved on. I watched him carefully. He had spent most of my life teaching me, unintentionally, how to recognize when someone answered around a problem. Dad rarely lied in ways that could be disproved with one sentence. He preferred partial truth. It gave him more room to move. The next document was the promotion declaration. The exact language mattered more than I had expected. It did not simply say he had worked on the framework. It described him as having led the original development of the methodology and certified that the information submitted in support of the promotion was complete and accurate to the best of his knowledge. A separate section asked for material contributors and outside relationships connected to the work. My name was nowhere. Marissa's company appeared later as an external vendor, but the family relationship was not disclosed in the section asking about potential conflicts. Dad argued that the omission had been administrative. I assumed procurement had already captured the relationship, he said. Marissa's name was hardly a secret. The compliance director asked, did you personally disclose that she was your daughter? I don't remember. Is there a disclosure form? I would assume so. We have not found one. Dad looked irritated. Then that is a process failure. Possibly, she said. We're determining whose. That answer quieted him. They turned next to the vendor trail. Marissa Nolan Consulting had billed the company for several categories of work over multiple years. Presentation development, executive communications, research support, methodology documentation. Most of those labels were broad enough that, standing alone, they proved nothing. Then the compliance director highlighted the entries tied to independent research. She asked Dad who had decided those tasks should be categorized that way. I don't remember. Was that your instruction? I don't recall giving a specific billing instruction. Did you review the invoices? Not every line. Did you approve them? Some approvals were routed through me. Marissa looked at him again. This time longer. Dad noticed. He turned slightly toward her. You handled the consulting deliverables. Her face changed. What? You handled the source files and how the work was packaged, he said. That was your scope. Marissa stared at him. The room went very still. The compliance director asked, Miss Nolan, were you responsible for determining the source of the materials you used? Marissa looked at my father before answering. I received source materials from different places. From Philip? Yes. From Erica? One updated deck years earlier. Did Philip later ask you for that deck? Yes. Dad cut in. And I assumed anything Erica had shared with Marissa was available for us to use as a reference. I looked at him. That was new. He was now turning Marissa into the bridge and treating the bridge itself as permission. The attorney asked, Did Erica ever tell you that? Dad answered, Not directly. Did she tell Marissa? I can't speak for Marissa. The compliance director turned to my sister. Did Erica authorize you to provide that material to Philip for corporate development? Marissa's mouth opened, then closed. No, she said. Dad shifted. But there was no restriction on the file, he added. I almost laughed. A month earlier, he had argued family did not need contracts. Now the absence of a written restriction had become his defense. the compliance director said. The issue is not whether the attachment was password protected. We're trying to determine understanding and intent. Dad's jaw tightened. They moved to the validation claims. That was where his tone changed. He said those results had been compiled through multiple operational sources and that he had relied on others to synthesize the information. Who? Henry asked. It was the first time he had spoken in nearly 20 minutes. Dad turned toward him. Internal teams, consultants. Which internal teams? I'd have to check. Which consultants? Dad looked at Marissa. The movement was small, but everyone saw it. Marissa handled much of the research package. My sister's face drained of color. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not sympathy exactly. Recognition. I knew that moment. I had lived versions of it for years. The instant when responsibility began sliding downhill toward the person expected to absorb it. Marissa said, I did not create those pilot numbers. Dad held up one hand. I didn't say you created them. You just said I handled the research package. You did. I handled presentation and research support. Yes, not validation. Dad's voice hardened. Then explain what you handled. Her eyes narrowed. I can. Something shifted in the room. Dad seemed not to hear it. He continued. You were the outside consultant. You maintained the source files. You prepared revised drafts. If something was categorized incorrectly, that happened at the vendor level before it came to me. Marissa stared at him. I had spent decades watching my father protect her. At least, that was how I had understood it. He paid for opportunities, introduced her to people, sent work to her company, defended her mistakes by saying she was still learning, told me she needed more support. I used to think favoritism meant Dad would always choose Marissa. That morning, I finally understood the condition attached to it. He would choose Marissa as long as choosing her did not require sacrificing himself. The compliance director asked, Miss Nolan, do you need a moment? Marissa looked down at her laptop. Yes. The meeting paused. Nobody left the room except Marissa. Dad reached for the coffee carafe, poured half a cup, then left it untouched. I looked at him. He avoided my eyes. A few minutes later, Marissa came back, carrying her laptop and a charger. She sat down without looking at Dad. I want to correct something, she said. The compliance director nodded. You can. When I said I received source materials from different places, that was true. But I also have the email history showing what Dad sent me and what I sent back. Dad turned toward her. Marissa. She ignored him. I told Erica before that I keep old client emails. I still have them. The compliance director said, Are those business records maintained in the ordinary course of your work? Yes. Have they been altered? No. Company counsel leaned forward. We'll need copies through an appropriate collection process. Please don't forward anything outside the instructions we give you. I understand. Dad said, There's no need to turn this into something it isn't. Marissa looked at him. What is it, Dad? He did not answer. She opened an old email archive. I can show you the threads now, and you can collect them formally afterward. The attorney nodded cautiously. You can identify them. We'll preserve properly after the meeting. Marissa searched. I watched the dates appear. Years old. The first thread contained the updated deck I had originally sent her. She had forwarded it to Dad. Her message said, in substance, that the deck was my original clinical model with updates, and asked whether he wanted her to strip out some of the hospital-facing language and rebuild it for an executive audience. Dad's reply was short. Keep the model. Change the presentation. Nobody spoke. It was not a confession saying, steal my daughter's work. It was worse in a quieter way. It showed he knew exactly what the source was. Marissa opened another thread from months later. She had sent him a draft work plan and asked whether the methodology support portion belonged under presentation services or research support. Dad replied that the client-facing work needed to be treated as independent research and methodology development, not merely slide design. The wording was corporate. Boring, almost. That was what made it damaging. It connected him directly to the label he had just claimed he did not remember assigning. Dad leaned forward. You're taking that out of context. Marissa looked at him. Then give them the context. I was talking about billing structure. Yes. That doesn't mean the underlying work wasn't legitimate. I didn't say it wasn't. Dad turned toward Henry. This is exactly what I mean. Every normal email is being interpreted in the worst possible way. Henry did not answer. Marissa opened a third thread. This one made her stop before reading. I could see her eyes moving across the screen. What? The compliance director asked. Marissa swallowed. This is about the validation section. Dad's posture changed. Marissa. She looked up at him. No. That single word carried years. Dad stared at her. The compliance director said, "Go ahead." Marissa read from the thread carefully. She had asked Dad where a set of performance figures came from because she could not match them to the material in the source package. Dad had replied that they reflected internal pilot experience and told her to use the summary figures provided for the executive deck. Marissa had asked whether she needed a source citation. Dad responded that the numbers were cleared for internal use and did not require footnoting in that presentation. I did not move. That email did not prove Dad invented the numbers, but it proved he had received a direct question about their source and instructed Marissa to use them anyway. The attorney asked, "Do you have the attachment containing the figures?" "Yes." "Who sent it to you?" "Dad." Dad exhaled sharply. "Because I received them internally." "From whom?" Henry asked. Dad looked at him. "I don't remember." Henry's expression did not change. "That answer is becoming a problem." Dad pushed back from the table. "I have been with this company for decades. I have managed thousands of documents, dozens of initiatives, multiple teams. You cannot expect me to remember the origin of every spreadsheet from years ago." "No," Henry said. "We expect the records to." Dad looked at Marissa. I will never forget that look. Not because it was angry, because it was betrayed. As if she had broken an agreement he believed existed automatically between them. He said, "You understand what you're doing?" Marissa's voice shook, but she did not look away. "Do you? You're handing them incomplete emails. You told them to ask me." Dad's face went still. Marissa continued, "So they asked." That was the first moment I felt anything close to satisfaction. Not because my sister had chosen me. She had not. She was choosing not to be buried under Dad's version of events. That difference mattered. The compliance director requested that Marissa stop opening additional records until the company could arrange proper collection and preservation. Marissa agreed. Dad objected to several interpretations. Company counsel noted those objections. Henry asked a few narrow questions about source verification. Nobody announced a verdict. Eventually, the compliance director turned to me. "Erica, is there anything else in your materials that we have not covered?" I looked at the binder in front of me. For weeks, it had felt heavy. Original capstone, submission receipt, email to Dad, updated deck, corporate comparison. My entire role in that room had been reduced to proving that something existed before someone else claimed to have created it. I closed the binder. "No." She waited. I put one hand on the cover. "That's everything that belongs to me." Dad looked at me. I stood. The meeting was not formally over, but my participation was. I thanked the compliance director and company counsel. Henry gave me a brief nod. Marissa did not look up. I had almost reached the door when Dad said my name. "Erika." I stopped. "Don't walk away from your family." For a second, I saw the old trap. If I left, I was abandoning them. If I stayed, I was responsible for repairing what they had broken. Either way, the burden belonged to me. I turned back. "I'm not walking away from my family." Dad stared at me. "I'm walking away from your definition of it." His face hardened. I opened the door and left. I was halfway to the elevator when I heard footsteps behind me. Henry. He did not try to stop me for a private conversation. He only said, "Erica." I turned. "I can't discuss the final determination yet." "I know." He nodded. Then he looked past me toward the conference room. "But I've told your father not to return to his office tomorrow. We'll contact him when the review is complete." The final determination came 12 days after the compliance meeting. By then, I had stopped checking my phone every time it buzzed. There is only so long a person can live inside anticipation before the body gets bored with panic and returns to ordinary things. I went to work. I drove Grace to school. I answered emails about training schedules. I bought groceries. I helped a new nurse prepare for her first education session. Dad remained off-site while the company finished the review. and nobody in my family contacted me directly, except Mom, who sent 2 short messages asking whether I had heard anything. I answered both the same way. No. The email from Henry's compliance team arrived just after lunch on a Thursday in mid-March. It did not contain the details of Dad's employment file because that was not mine to receive. It did confirm what affected my role in the review. The company had completed its determination regarding the framework, corrected the provenance record, and closed the portion of the inquiry requiring my participation. An hour later, Marissa called. Her voice told me before her words did. They fired him. I sat down in the empty education office and looked through the glass wall at the hallway. When? This morning. For what? I don't know the exact language they gave him. That was believable. She took a breath. He said it was for cause. I closed my eyes briefly. I had known firing was possible. I had even known it was likely after the meeting. Hearing that it had actually happened still felt heavier than I expected. Marissa continued. They canceled the promotion. They're reviewing part of his incentive compensation tied to the framework. He says they're trying to claw money back. Reviewing isn't the same as taking it. I know. She sounded exhausted. What about you? I asked. My contract is terminated. I waited. They said they're reviewing invoices connected to methodology development and research support. If they decide there are charges that can't be supported by the actual deliverables, they may seek repayment under the contract. Again, may. Not instant bankruptcy. Not everything she had earned disappearing in one dramatic afternoon. Real consequences usually arrived as letters, reviews, canceled access, and numbers people had to explain. I'm sorry, I said. Marissa was quiet for so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. Then she said, Are you? Yes. You don't sound sorry. I don't know what you want sorry to sound like. A short laugh escaped her, bitter but not cruel. Fair. I leaned back in my chair. Did they say you did anything criminal? No. Then deal with what they actually said. You make it sound easy. I didn't say easy. She went quiet again. Then she said, Dad told Mom. I destroyed him. I almost smiled, though there was nothing funny about it. Of course he did. He says I handed them everything they needed. You handed them emails they were entitled to review after he tried to put the responsibility on you. That's not how he sees it. I know. Marissa inhaled shakily. I thought he'd protect me. There it was. Not about contracts. Not about money. Not even about losing clients. The thing underneath all of it? I know, I said. He always did. I thought about that. No, I said carefully. He protected you when protecting you cost him less than losing you. She did not answer. I continued before I could soften it into something less true. When he had to choose between you and himself, he chose himself. Marissa started crying quietly, not dramatically. No sobbing apology, just the sound of someone trying not to breathe too hard into the phone. He lit her. After a minute, she said, I'm sorry. I did not ask what part. I knew enough by then to understand that apologies given under pressure can be sincere and still incomplete. I believe you're sorry, I said. She sniffed. That doesn't mean I trust you. I know. It was the first time she had accepted a boundary without arguing that family should erase it. We ended the call without making plans. That was fine. Not every relationship needed a reunion scene. Some needed distance long enough to learn whether regret would become different behavior. The company asked me to come in the following week to complete one final documentation step. They had retained electronic copies of my source materials, but a few physical originals and marked up pages needed to be returned. I could have had them mailed. Instead, I went because I wanted the originals back in my own hands. That was how I ended up in the lobby on the morning Dad left the building. I did not know he would be there. But my presence was not some coincidence arranged by fate either. His termination had happened days earlier, and that morning was the scheduled time for him to collect personal belongings under supervision. My documentation appointment fell in the same building because the review had finally closed. I was signing a receipt at the reception desk when the elevator doors opened. Dad stepped out carrying a cardboard box. For a second, I barely recognized him. Not because he looked ruined. He did not. He looked exactly like a man carrying office things in a cardboard box. a framed family photograph, 2 books, a leather notebook, a coffee mug, a small desk clock. Then I saw the glass award. Leadership through family values. He had placed it upright between the books and the photograph. The same award that had been on the mantel behind him Christmas Eve. The same award Grace had seen while Dad told her there was no room at his table. I watched him walk toward the lobby. Henry came out of a corridor behind him with someone from HR. Dad saw me. His expression hardened immediately. Before either of us spoke, Henry looked down at the box. That stays. Dad stopped. For a moment, he seemed genuinely confused. Henry pointed to the award. The award is company property pending rescission. Dad stared at him. You're taking that too? Henry's voice remained neutral. It was issued under the company recognition program. The determination invalidated the basis for the award. Nobody in the lobby moved. No employees gathered to watch. No one applauded. That made it better. Dad looked down at the glass. I saw his hand tighten around the edge. For years, he had treated that award like proof of something larger than his job. Proof that the story he told about himself had been accepted by people with titles and money and influence. Now the same institution that had handed it to him was saying the story no longer met the conditions under which the award had been given. Dad lifted the glass from the box. For 1 second, I thought he might argue. Instead, he placed it on the reception counter. The engraved words faced me. Leadership through family values. I had no clever thought, no private victory speech. I just looked at it and remembered Grace standing in my kitchen, asking whether she had done something wrong. Dad turned toward me. You happy? Henry glanced between us, then walked away with HR. I appreciated that. He did not try to mediate my family. Dad stepped closer. You got what you wanted. I had imagined that accusation so many times that when he finally said it, I felt almost nothing. No, I said. I got my name back. His mouth twisted. You think that's what this is about? That's what my part was about. You called Henry. Yes. You started the review. I gave him information. You handed them the knife. I looked at the box in his arms. No, I handed them documents. His face reddened. You can tell yourself whatever you need to tell yourself. I nodded. So can you. He stared at me. I had no desire to explain further. That was another thing I had learned. Not every false accusation needed a defense. Dad could believe I destroyed him, if that version allowed him to avoid looking at the signatures, the invoices, the omitted disclosure, the emails, and the validation claims. I did not need to take that story away from him. He adjusted the box against his chest. I hope it was worth it. I looked him directly in the eyes. You did the rest yourself. His face went still. Then he walked past me. I watched the lobby doors close behind him and felt something I had not expected. Not triumph. Relief. The kind that comes when you finally stop holding open a door someone has spent years refusing to walk through honestly. My meeting upstairs took less than 30 minutes. The compliance director returned my original marked-up capstone and the old submission receipt I had brought for verification. Then she told me the company was correcting the authorship and provenance record in the internal materials still associated with the Surge framework. I asked what that meant. It means future use of the methodology will reflect that the foundational clinical model originated with your work and was inaccurately represented in prior materials. Will Dad's name be removed? Where appropriate, yes. Other contributors will still be identified for the work they actually performed. That mattered to me. I did not want Dad erased from things he genuinely changed. I wanted the record to stop erasing me. The third-party submission archive from my leadership program had helped settle the earliest chronology. My dated capstone, the archive receipt, the emails, and later corporate records all lined up closely enough that the company no longer had a good faith reason to keep calling Philip the original developer. The compliance director asked whether I would be willing to participate in an internal presentation about the corrected history and practical use of the framework. No. She blinked. No? I'm not interested in replacing Dad as the face of it. She nodded slowly. What would you like us to do? Correct the record everywhere my name was removed. That's it? That's it. I meant it. For weeks, Dad had acted as though I wanted his stage. I did not. I wanted the thing he had taken before the stage ever existed. Attribution. Accuracy. My own name attached to my own work. A few days later, I received the revised internal description. It credited the foundational clinical model to Erica Nolan and identified later corporate adaptations separately. I printed one copy. I did not frame it. I did not post it online. I placed it in the same professional folder where I kept my certification records and original capstone. Then I went to pick up Grace. Mom called that night. She had waited longer than I expected. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. Philip showed me the correction. I assumed he would. Do you realize what seeing your name there is doing to him? I looked at Grace through the kitchen doorway. She was lying on the living room rug doing homework, one foot moving in the air behind her. Yes, I said. Mom inhaled. And you don't care? That isn't what I said. Couldn't you have asked them not to make it public inside the company? No. Why? Because it's accurate. Erica, your father has lost his job. He lost the promotion. They took the award. How much more does he have to lose? I closed my eyes for a second. There it was again. Her favorite measurement. How much did the person in front of her need? Who could absorb more? Who was doing fine enough to give something back? Mom, the correction isn't punishment. It feels like punishment to him. I know. That doesn't bother you? It bothers me that he still thinks my name being attached to my work is something being done to him. She went quiet. I continued. I'm not asking the company to humiliate Dad. I'm not posting anything. I'm not calling his friends. I'm not chasing him for money. I'm not doing anything except refusing to ask people to leave the record wrong because the truth hurts him. You sound so cold. That word did not cut the way it used to. I'm not cold. You've shut us out. No, I changed the rules. You won't let me keep Grace. I won't leave her with you unsupervised right now. Same thing. No, she sighed. I could hear Dad somewhere in the background, but I could not make out what he was saying. Mom lowered her voice. He's lost Marissa too. That's between them. She barely speaks to him. He tried to make her responsible for the invoices and validation work when the review tightened. He was under pressure. So was she. Mom did not answer. I thought about Marissa sitting across from Dad at that conference table, finally understanding that being the favorite did not mean being safe. Family systems change quickly once the person who always absorbs the cost steps away. Dad no longer had me to fix the factual record. Marissa was no longer willing to protect him at her own expense. Mom could still explain him, defend him, soften him, but explanations were no longer enough to restore the old structure. I have to help Grace with homework, I said. Erika. Yes? Are you really willing to lose your family over this? I looked into the living room. Grace was not listening. For once, I wanted the answer to be uncomplicated. I'm not losing my family. Mom said nothing. I'm deciding what family is allowed to cost me. I ended the call. By late April, the snow was gone. Chicago spring had arrived in its usual indecisive way, warm one afternoon and cold enough for jackets again the next morning. The hospital had completed its review weeks earlier. The complaint against me had not been sustained in the way Dad intended. The original capstone had clean provenance, no patient-identifiable information, and the later materials had been separated and reviewed according to their actual history. I returned to the education work I had temporarily stepped away from. Nothing magical happened to my career. I did not become famous. Henry did not offer me some glamorous executive position, and I would not have taken one if he had. I liked my work. That had never been the problem. On one Friday evening, Mrs. Palmer came over for dinner with her daughter. Nothing fancy. Roast chicken, potatoes, salad, and bread. Grace had insisted on warming herself because she had recently decided the oven made her basically a chef. I set plates on the table while Grace carried glasses from the kitchen. Then she stopped. Mom? What? She counted the chairs. Do we have enough? The question was casual, but I knew where it came from. I looked at the table. 4 places set. 1 extra chair along the wall. For a second, I saw Christmas Eve again. Grace at my parents' table, Dad closing the binder. The glass award behind him. There's no room for you. I walked over and pulled the extra chair closer to the table anyway. We do. Grace nodded and set down the last glass. Mrs. Palmer arrived a few minutes later, and dinner started normally. Grace talked too much about school. I complained that she had put enough butter on the bread to alarm a cardiologist. She told me that was why I worked in the ER. After dinner, she began stacking plates. For it once. I can handle it, she said when I reached for two. I took them anyway. You don't always have to. She rolled her eyes. Mom, they're plates. I know. You're doing the weird thing again. Probably. She smiled. I carried 2 plates to the kitchen. Grace followed with the other 2. That was all. No grand speech. No family reunion. No apology from Dad. No moment where everyone finally admitted I had been right. A few months earlier, I would have thought closure required something like that. It did not. My father had spent years acting as though strength made me easier to take from. My mother believed being capable meant I needed less. My sister had learned that my work could become useful family property if enough people agreed not to call it mine. And somewhere along the way, I had started believing the same thing about myself. I could handle it. So I should. That was the rule. Until it wasn't. I set the plates in the sink and turned back toward the dining room. Grace was pulling out her chair. There was room for her. There was room for me. And for the first time in a very long time, neither of us had to earn it. When people keep telling you that you are the strong one, be careful not to confuse strength with obligation. Being capable does not mean you should carry every burden, forgive every betrayal, or stay silent while someone else takes credit for your work. You can love your family and still insist on boundaries. You can help people without giving them ownership of your time, your ideas, your money, or your future. And when someone makes a harmful choice, fixing the damage does not make their choice acceptable. The best response is not always the loudest one. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is protect the people who depend on you, document what happened, tell the truth clearly, and let the proper process handle the consequences. You should also remember that facts matter most when you are willing to stand behind them. Do not exaggerate, do not invent evidence, and do not destroy your own credibility just because you are angry. If you are wrong, correct yourself. If you are right, you do not need to make the truth more dramatic than it already is. Most importantly, do not teach your children that being loved means proving how much pain they can handle. Teach them that asking for help is allowed, that respect is not something they have to earn by suffering quietly, and that there should always be room for them at the table. You may not be able to control whether other people admit what they did, but you can control what you continue to participate in. Sometimes the healthiest ending is not getting an apology. It is finally refusing to carry consequences that belong to someone else. If this story gave you something useful to think about, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for more stories about family, boundaries, accountability, and the choices that finally change everything.